Hello and welcome to this edition of Agatha Christie Read With Me. This series is dedicated to tackling every Agatha Christie novel ever written in sequential order, and for this second video, we're tackling her second book, The Secret Adversary, published in 1922. This video will have chapter markers so you can read along with me chapter by chapter as I discuss the bullet point outlines of what we just read and add characters, questions, theories, and clues to our investigative board as we go along. A link is provided in the description below to a free copy of the ebook provided by the Gutenberg Project. Will you reach the same conclusions I do? Will my theories prove correct? Will we catch a killer? Let's find out together. Hello and welcome to this episode, The Secret Adversary. Since this book starts out with a prologue, I thought it might actually be a good idea to just kind of hunker down a little bit here and just catch folks up. So this is the second video I've done in this series, the first of which was The Mysterious Affair at Styles, because of course, I'm tackling all of the Agatha Christie novels that are part of this Bantam Publishing style here, 89 books, and I'm doing them in chronological order from publication date. So, second book in the series, The Secret Adversary. And as I understand it, I mean, I know nothing about this book, but as I understand it, it is not a Poirot novel. It's simply an Agatha Christie novel, and I'm very intrigued to see how this all turns out. So, the prologue has happened now. And not a lot. I mean, it wasn't a large one, but we do have a bit of intrigue as the Lusitania is going down. Famous ship disaster that happened in 1915, and a man enlists the help of a woman to deliver secret papers to the American embassy. So right out of the gate, we're already involved with wartime intel gathering, spying, espionage, who knows what, could be anything, but it's definitely going to play a part in the book to follow. So if we take a look at the board here, I wiped the slate clean. I haven't done anything on this, and generally, the idea from, if you watch my video on The Mysterious Affair at Styles, this board filled up quite a bit. And as I continue on with the series, I'm eventually going to get to a place where everything feels right. Everything feels organic, and I have a template that I can move forward with. As it is, I'm not convinced that I've done that quite yet, but I do know what has worked for me. I do know what didn't work for me, especially in knowing the secrets at the end of that book and the failures that the board provided to highlight in terms of the details. So I'm going to use a lot of the information moving forward to adapt a brand new board here and see if I can maybe make this a little bit cleaner, a little bit more refined, and hopefully solve whatever mystery that is going to be taking place here in The Secret Adversary. I'm intrigued, I'm interested, and I'm optimistic. Perhaps a little bit too much so, but we'll find out. So let's get into it. I'm going to read chapter 1, you're going to read chapter 1, and then we'll meet back up here in just a moment. I'll talk to you soon. Okay, so chapter 1 is now done. One thing I should note is, if you're following this series in order, that this book is actually a little bit different in structure to the previous entry of The Mysterious Affair at Styles. That was about the same page count according to my publication here. This one's a little bit larger, but still not extremely, but that was 13 chapters. This one's 28 chapters. So I'm imagining that these segments are going to be a little bit shorter as the chapters are going to be shorter. And I'm going to try and not be repeating myself and going on way too long on each one. So let's dig into what happened here in chapter 1. So this was going to be a lot of character introductions, as these are. So we primarily get introduced to the two characters, I'm going to say main characters just so far, of Tommy Thomas Beresford and Tuppence Prudence Cowley, who appear to be friends, old friends that during the Great War they met when Tuppence was working in a hospital and Tommy was an injured soldier, a lieutenant. And haven't seen each other in a number of years since then. So the timeline that seems to be taking place right now, we don't have a specific year, certainly not a month or day, but generally this seems to kind of be taking place anywhere between a couple of months. It seems safer to say more than a year after the armistice, after the World War I armistice. So we're probably talking about 1920 or so. The book was published in 1922, so it's very possible we're talking about present day in terms of when the book was written. So we could be talking about 1922. But regardless, it has taken place a while after World War I, and generally the state of everybody and everything is in economic upheaval, including Tommy and Tuppence, who were demobbed. And looking that up, demobbed basically means discharged, only a little bit more broad range than that. So the hospitals and the hotels and so forth that were kind of taken over by the government, it's not just the soldiers, it's basically anything that was taken over for the war effort being let go of that war effort, let go of that government influence and brought back to the world of private enterprise. These two characters are kind of just floating around on their own. So one thing I did here in the chart, in the map, in the board, is this chapter summaries portion. So I think this is going to be a little bit similar to what was done before, but it's going to kind of break it down by chapter. And if I need to get more refined with some kind of sub bullet points, then I'll have more stuff happening here. But this one was fairly short. Not a whole lot happened here. We had Tommy and Tuppence meet, go out for tea and biscuits, catch up on old times, bemoan their lack of money. And then Tuppence brings up, well, if we can't marry into money, if we don't inherited money, then we're going to have to make money. So let's talk about putting out an ad for a do anything adventurer advertisement. Which seems like a fun kind of introduction to these characters. And, it's like, well, let's go on an adventure. Let's steal some diamonds. Let's do stuff. Make some money, either legally or illegally. Nothing is off the table. And Tommy winds up coming around to agreeing with Tuppence there. So they agree to meet the next day at noon, and Tuppence gets stopped by a man calling after her, and that is the way the chapter ends. So just taking a closer look at these characters, I'm kind of trying to put some bullet points in there here. I don't want to get flooded with too much information, but at the same time, I don't want to let fine details kind of pass me by that could prove pertinent later. And that's the trickiest part of this whole thing, is sifting the information. What's important, what's not important, and what to discard, what to keep, and the stuff that you keep in what order. So I kind of did my best here, just getting some of the bullet points. So Tommy here, red hair, hasn't seen Tuppence since 1916 in the hospital, twice wounded in the Great War, demobbed, and while he was in Egypt during the armistice, stayed in the military for a little while in Egypt until he was demobbed. And he has a rich uncle who tried to adopt him despite Tommy's mother, and Tommy rebuffed that. He did not want anything to do with that. So yeah, he's in a state of, I get the impression that neither of them are absolutely destitute, but they are struggling. They were able to afford their tea and biscuits. Tuppence is staying at a hostel. So there's money, just not a lot of it. And they're certainly wanting more. Tuppence has black bobbed hair, hasn't seen Tommy since 1916 in the hospital. Fifth daughter of Archdeacon Cowley of Little Missendell, Suffolk, which, so she's a reverend's daughter there. Kind of leads to some interesting little moral choices that were happening later. Then worked at a London hospital, then as a driver, then in a government office during the Great War. Continued working in the office for a few months after armistice before she was demobbed. So yeah, not really a whole lot to go on here. They're friends. They get met up. They don't have money. They want money. They're going to start an adventure thing. And it looks like the adventurer may have found them instead. But we're going to find out in chapter 2. No sense dawdling about it. I'm going to read chapter 2. You're going to read chapter 2. Right, Sammy? And we will meet back up in just a little bit. So that was a pretty interesting chapter. A lot of, I know, I know, I know, I know, what do you know, I know, and a lot of fun back and forth kind of things were happening there. So to get started, we get introduced to the character of Edward Whittington, who is a big man and clean shaven. And so going over to the bullet point events of chapter 2 here, we see that Tuppence gets introduced to Edward Whittington, who proposes to meet at his office at the Estonia Glassware Company the next day at 11 o'clock. Tuppence sends a telegram using Thomas's pencil to Thomas, informing him not to place the ad quite yet. She took the pencil from Thomas when they were writing the ad at the cafe. And there's no sense in spending money on the ad if we're going to have an opportunity to just drop into our lap. May as well seize what's going on here. So the next day, she goes and meets Whittington at his office in the top floor of the building, and he proposes an idea to her where she gets £100 with all expenses paid. All she has to do is take a very pleasant trip to Paris and then stay at, I apologize for my French pronunciation of things in advance, stay at a pensionnat de jeunes filles, which is essentially a boarding school. And it's Madame Colombier in the Avenue de Neuilly. Sorry, I apologize. I'm really actually trying there. And then while she's there, to stay in character as Whittington's ward, to not reveal her true identity. And as she already has a little bit of an American accent, to instead of hiding that, to actually lean into it, to hide her British roots and to actually make herself appear as an American. Why? To what end? Doesn't really reveal. And this kind of seems like a do not ask situation. Just take the money, smile, and there you go. However, things take a turn here. When Whittington doesn't include Tommy in the deal, it causes Tuppence to basically just, I'm out, which is really noble of her in all honesty. It's like, this is my partner, considering they haven't actually worked a job yet. This was all just kind of a theoretical thing that they discussed over tea. No, this is my partner, and if he's not in, then I'm not in. So, and he stops her. He's like, wait. We can work something out. Let's talk about this, Miss. And she replies, Jane Finn, which just changes everything immediately in ways we don't know quite yet why. But Jane Finn, if you recall in chapter 1, and I added this bullet point because it didn't seem important at the time, but that's the nature of this whole thing. When they go out for tea and biscuits, they're overhearing tidbits of conversation. And do you know, she sat down and cried when I told her she couldn't have the flat after all. Well, it was simply a bargain, my dear, just like the one Mabel Lewis brought from Paris. And then Tommy explains that he also overheard a conversation of two men talking about Jane Finn, which is an unusual name, and I guess caused Tuppence to recall it, that it was something, like recent memory, that she at least just plucked it out of thin air and gave her name as Jane Finn. And then the whole tone, the whole atmosphere of the room and Whittington especially changed. He gets visibly angry, purple veins in his forehead. So that's your game, is it? You knew all the time what I wanted you for, but you kept up the comedy. Who's been blabbing, Rita? And Tuppence says, no, Rita wasn't involved. She's basically playing along like she knows what he's talking about, but doesn't actually. But what she does recognize is that, the more people involved with this, like a Rita, the worse it's going to be. So no, Rita wasn't involved. How much do you know? How much do you want? And that last question really perked her ears there. So this really kind of turned into a bit of a fun sparring session of she has no clue why this name triggered him the way that it did. All she knows is that she wants to get out of this room with money in hand. She sees an opportunity, and it just turns into a verbal exchange of trying to eke information out of each other when clearly one side doesn't have any and the other side has all of it. Who has the power in the room? It just turns into a very, very delicate dance. And I can't help but feel like Tuppence is immediately in way over her head, and things are kicking off in ways that she will never, ever anticipate the consequences and the fallout from this conversation. Regardless, she manages to hold her own at the very least and feign innocence while not revealing she actually knows nothing, leading to ultimately a conversational stalemate. At which point, Whittington receives a phone message, which leads him to wrap up the conversation and basically tosses her £50 and instructions to come back the same time tomorrow. His impression is that he is being blackmailed. For what? We don't know. All we know is it has something to do with the name Jane Finn. So there's a lot going on here, and there's no real that we know of clues, or we don't even know the nature of the mystery, what's going to be happening here. This could be that it's not a whodunit, it's not a mystery in any way. It could just be a fun adventure book. I honestly know nothing about this, other than it says Agatha Christie Mystery Collection on the front. But so I'm assuming it's a mystery. What it is that we're even supposed to be solving in this mystery, what clues we're supposed to be uncovering, what ultimate thing we're supposed to unlock this puzzle box, don't even know the shape of it yet. So we're finding out, early days yet, which means I'm going to get straight into chapter 3. I'll read, you read, and we'll see each other in just a moment. Bold moves indeed. So again, these are fast chapters. There's a fair amount going on, but they are dressing it like it's a staccato fashion. It's just bullet point after bullet point, and there's not a lot of stuff to put on the board in terms of clues, threads, anything along those lines. It's simply stuff's happening. So let's get into it with the bullet points that has happened for chapter 3. Tuppence and Tommy have a night on the town eating rich foods. They have 50 pounds to spend, and by God, they're going to spend them well. So they take the opportunity while they're having a meal for Tuppence to catch Tommy up, tell him everything that happened in terms of the meeting with Mr. Whittington and all that happened there that, well, ended up with her getting the 50 pounds. So he brings up that, well, this is pretty much it, that, you know, there's really nowhere else to go, because any further that Tuppence even tries to go with this, she's going to inadvertently tip her hand that she really, truly, genuinely doesn't know anything. She's already tried saying it, honestly, but there will be a time in which he will just simply like, well, yeah, okay, she doesn't know anything. So without any information, there's nowhere else for this whole debacle to go in terms of getting any more money. So enjoy the lobster, enjoy the Turkish coffee, and that's about it. But Tuppence says, no, wait. Instead, if we don't have information, maybe we can actually use this as an opportunity to get information. That maybe there's some information out there that we could actually put into our back pockets and not necessarily use for blackmail, but at the very least strengthen our position in terms of continuing this whole bluff game situation. So they hatch a plan where Tuppence will continue on with the scheduled planned meeting at 11 o'clock at the Estonia Glassware Company, and Tommy will be kind of waiting outside. They'll signal each other, and then Tommy will be the one to follow Mr. Whittington and try to get something, some measure of information that they can use. Tommy being the one that has not really interacted with him and would probably not be recognized. So that's generally what they plan on doing, and they go to do it. However, everything kind of gets foiled when Tuppence does indeed go up to see Mr. Whittington, and Estonia Glassware Company is no longer. They kind of go up and they meet up with the building worker who says, you know, yeah, they shuttered their doors yesterday afternoon. If you want, the space is available to let, but yeah, they're gone. And once again, Tommy sees this as an air of defeat, which I think is all honesty, probably the logical and probably, time will tell, the more wise of the scenarios. But Tuppence is not to be dissuaded, and she has one more idea up her sleeve, that if the information can't be gathered from Whittington himself, that perhaps information regarding the name of Jane Finn could be found somewhere out there, putting them back into the game, getting them back on the trail of Whittington, and at least finding out what in the world this name triggered in terms of this emotional response. So she sets about writing out a new ad. Wanted. Any information respecting Jane Finn, apply YA, Young Adventurers, I'm assuming there. So again, there's not really a huge amount of mystery in terms of threads to tie together, clues to connect with one another, anything along those lines, timelines to really stretch things out and dot by dot retrace the steps of past events. But more just kind of right now a linear novel, and I mean enjoying it. So there's just not a lot to put on the board aside from the bullet point summaries of what's going on in each chapter at the moment. Just taking a moment to reflect, though, I do just kind of want to comment that I am quite enjoying the Tuppence and Tommy characters. The Tuppence especially is remarkably fun and perhaps, operating outside of her league, getting herself into way too much trouble, getting Tommy into way too much trouble. But there's an intelligence, a quick-wittedness at the very least there, and just a sense of not really letting danger be as much of a caution as perhaps it should. But for the reader, that turns out to be quite fun. So I'm eager to see what happens in chapter 4. Let's get to reading and we'll meet back up in just a moment. Chapter 4 is in the bag, and we have a lot of twists and turns and reveals that happened here, so let's jump into the board here, looking at the bullet points of what happened. The ad is placed. It is printed on Thursday, and then Friday, Tommy and Tuppence agree to meet at the National Gallery to discuss any replies that the ad received. Tommy reveals, after a little bit of cheeky back and forth, that 2 replies were indeed received. And when they opened them together, they found that the first one was from an A. Carter requesting a meeting that day at 11 o'clock, which wasn't a whole lot of time, but they could rush it. And if they take the tube, they can get there on time. The second was from a Julius P. Hersheimmer wanting a meeting at lunchtime. So they can do both. And obviously the one that had the specified time that they need to rush to is the first priority. So they have the meeting with A. Carter. They arrive at the house, they get brought inside, and they sit down, and they meet up with an individual who is a bit of a dynamic personality, who then asks them what they know about Jane Finn. And of course, Tuppence is reluctant to spill the beans, mostly because there aren't a whole lot of beans to spill, but that's exactly what she doesn't want to reveal. However, Tommy, in a surprise, says, no, we're going to tell you everything, and reveals that he recognizes Mr. Carter from when Tommy worked in intelligence in France, and before his actual identity was revealed. Like, oh, people know me here as Mr. Carter, so that's fine for now. And so they tell the story, and as they're going through, I loved that he had to kind of cover his mouth to hide that he's smiling a little bit as they're telling this story. And then Carter explains who Jane Finn is, really kind of just lays it all out. Whether or not he's telling the truth or the whole truth, we'll see. But Jane Finn, as we get explained here, is the American from the prologue who received the oilskin pouch containing the treaty when the Lusitania was sinking, and apparently has not been heard from since. This treaty is in the wind and nobody knows what happened to it. So also explains that the treaty, which apparently at the time of the Great War was a strategic move, turned out to be something that in hindsight, after everything has settled, probably wouldn't be ideal for it to come out. So it would actually harm the government in revealing that this treaty had even been attempted. So yeah, there's some kind of motivation that's happening there in terms of wanting to find out what happened to it, where it is, who has it, and to what ends. But to what ends, they are surmising that because it can be used to harm the current government, and there are Bolshevists seeking to disrupt the government in favor of the labor movement, they suspect that they are using that treaty and or Jane Finn as weapons. However, they're not entirely sure that they actually have the treaty. There is some evidence to suggest that they do, but then some of the details that are being kind of spilled seem a little bit inaccurate. And they also went through a measure to explain that it wasn't in a cipher, that would actually be a little bit against the grain of what they were even intending to do with the treaty, that it was in plain English. So the idea that any details were wrong in it, or any details were wrong in the reporting of having it later on, seem a little bit suspicious. Further, the Bolsheviks do have a secret operative that is working in England, Mr. Brown, one of the criminal masterminds. And Mr. Brown apparently operates a bit in the shadows. There'll often be times in which they think they got him. There's this big head cheese taking meetings and so on. And then they come to find out that no, it was that other person in the corner that you didn't even recognize was important. And then he slipped away by the time you did. So yeah, they come to sort of the conclusion that during the meeting that Tuppence had with Mr. Whittington, the assistant that handed him the phone message was actually Mr. Brown, and he wasn't delivering a phone message, he was delivering instructions from boss to employee. So yeah, a lot of good intrigue here. So basically they are now entrusted with the quest to continue their search for Jane Finn. We have our MacGuffin. We have actually two MacGuffins, one in the treaty and one in Jane Finn herself. So yeah, that's generally where we're at right now. We don't, again, have a whole lot of mystery in terms of whodunits, anything along those lines, but we are in a interesting position of intrigue and kind of taking a look at some of the new characters. I did add Mr. Brown here. I didn't have him before, but now he seems like a bit of an important character, to be sure. I did list him as assistant, and I'll fill in some of the details in a little bit here as we kind of get them. And I also added A. Carter to the list, dynamic personality, a real name unknown. But the real one is Jane Finn. Now, I could have put just a generic woman face on here, but I honestly think that the intrigue surrounding her is a little bit more in keeping with the theme of what's going on, because all we know is what A. Carter has told us. We don't actually know that she was the American from the Lusitania. We don't know anything. Jane Carter could be the name of the operation that the treaty was being delivered on, or we don't know who or what Jane Finn is exactly quite yet. All we have is the word of one other character, and we don't know enough to trust him. So I'm leaving it as a big old question mark. But we have our MacGuffin, we have our goal, and now Tommy and Tuppence have one more meeting of the responses that came from the ad. So let's find out what happens. I'm assuming that chapter 5 is going to be that second meeting, but we'll see. So chapter 5 up next. I'll talk to you soon. So the meeting with Mr. Carter continues. They discuss finer details such as payment, expectations, and the unofficial status that TNT will be working in. That actually seems like a fairly, nice little abbreviation for the two, since I have a feeling we're going to be saying Tommy and Tuppence quite a bit. So, basically, if you wind up in Dutch with the police, we can't help you, but we can still pay you and we can give you this operation and see if you can apply through your ingenuity, creativity, and your outsider status, and hopefully succeed in ways that are conventional investigative methods have failed so far. So upon leaving, Tommy tells Tuppence who Mr. Carter is in actuality. The reader still doesn't know. We don't know yet. He whispered it in her ear, and then afterward they rush off to meet Julius P. Hersheimmer. So this is a fairly interesting introduction here, and I gotta be honest, I'm really not trusting Hersheimmer at this point. I'm not trusting anybody, but this seems a little bit too, I don't know, the backstory flimsy in my estimation. But regardless, they go through a little bit of back and forth as far as like information sharing to establish who they are in relation to each other, or in relation more specifically to Jane. Hersheimmer under the mistaken impression that perhaps these two were kidnappers and trying to shake him down for money. And finally things get cleared up, and everybody has at least a little bit of tentative trust going on now. So Julius shares that he is Jane's cousin. He's wealthy, he's inherited money from his family, and he wanted to reconnect with his aunt's side of the family, and in doing so found that Jane was the only living member but is now missing. So he wants her found. He's kind of in the same boat as TNT. He also reports that the police have really not been a whole lot of help in this. However, a Scotland Yard officer did come around for a photograph yesterday, so apparently they're still kind of working on it. After establishing a warm enough relationship, the trio go to lunch together, at which Julius receives a business card from Inspector Japp, CID Scotland Yard, who I wonder, well, what does he want? I don't have any more photographs to give. The negatives were destroyed. There's literally 0 more photographs of Jane after he gave that one to Inspector Brown. Dun dun dun. Lot of intrigue happening here. And not only did we add some new characters, but we have our first character crossover from the first Agatha Christie novel of A Mysterious Affair at Styles. We have Detective Inspector James Japp from Scotland Yard back with us. He was the one that did not know of Poirot. His partner did, and while his partner was singing Poirot's praises, he did not really understand what was going on, or really believe that this little Belgian man could pull off the miracles that he did. Seemed like a sturdy enough officer, man of integrity, and above board. So we're happy to have James Japp back in the picture here. We added Julius P. Hersheimmer And I added mother, father to him and to Jane Finn, just so I could establish a link between his father and her mother as siblings. So that establishes kind of the cousin relationship that's happening there. So where to report from here? I want to keep these chapter segments a little bit short, especially while we're not actually drawing lines together. And I got to be honest, I'm not sure if we're going to have lines to draw together. I'm not sure if we're going to have anything on this board other than characters and chapter summaries. So far, this seems to be a fairly interesting and entertaining, and I'm enjoying it, spy thriller more than an actual mystery. So I'm not sure how much we're actually going to be tying threads between events to try and figure out who did what, when, and so on. But I'm still going to keep it up. I'm still going to keep up the board, and I'm going to keep up these little interstitial summaries, mostly because I think that they're fascinating. I'm having fun with this. I hope you're having fun with this. And I want to have an established time frame in place here, because when we get to, say, chapter 21, and they're talking about past events, I want to have a very clear recollection visually of what happened when, what information was disseminated to what character and in what chapter and in what context. So by keeping this bullet point list and keeping up the summaries as I have, I think that the merit in this is hopefully going to have some feet. So we shall see. But in the meantime, there's really nothing more to discuss. There's nothing more to really theorize at the moment, unless it's like, where Jane is. And honestly, it could be anywhere in the entire world. But if I had to guess, I'd say that the next stop is going to be Paris. I think that they're going to be looking at that boarding school and seeing generally what was that all about. That Whittington wanted Tuppence to go to this boarding school in Paris and posing as Jane. Why? To what end? What was the visibility going to be like? Was she going to be posing as Jane for somebody else to observe, to trick somebody, to maybe get Julius's money in kind of a espionage hostage, not really actually having a hostage, but pretending to have a hostage situation? Who knows? Could be a whole lot of things. But however it shakes out, we're going to continue on with the story in chapter 6. Well, they didn't go to Paris now, did they? Chapter 6, a plan of campaign. So I guess what happened is finding out that Hersheimmer had also been duped by Mr. Brown affected a rapprochement, which is basically a rekindling of a friendly nature. So this is like solidifying the trust that they have in each other somehow. You got duped by him, we got duped by him. Friend! They decide to go ahead and just tell him the entirety of the story, and he's tickled pink by it. I still don't trust him. But now they're staying at the Ritz, and for these two that were just, out on the streets, almost penniless, just, a week before, things are really kind of looking up for them. Or at the very least, if the danger is there, it's kind of just under the surface. But people are throwing money at them left and right, giving them opportunities left and right. And from what I understand about post-World War I London, that's a rarity. So, yeah, they're riding high. But unfortunately, now they're at the Ritz. And Tommy, well, he doesn't have any ideas. He has a lot of flippancy and a lot of barbs and applause and laughter and so forth, but no real ideas. And Tuppence is the one basically saying, look, nobody's going to be, continue bankrolling this if we're not actually producing anything, or at the very least doing something. So let's do something. And what, bereft of ideas, he kind of, he doesn't really have a whole lot to contribute, but she does. And it's actually pretty intelligent too. So she says that there are two clues. One, she knows what Whittington looks like, which is not a whole lot to go on in the place the size of London, assuming he's even in London. And also the name of Rita that Whittington let drop. Okay, so that's still not a whole lot to go on, but again, quite intelligently, she surmises that it's entirely possible that whoever was following Danvers on the Lusitania was a woman, and an attractive one at that, basically, trying to think of what an espionage operation would look like that had Danvers on it, somebody nipping at his heels that caused him to give the oilskin pouch to Jane when he did. And considering the information itself did survive the Lusitania, that Danvers gave the oilskin pouch to somebody, it's also likely that whoever this operative was survived. So Tuppence puts the query into Mr. Carter, asking for a list of the survivors of the Lusitania, and susses out who the women are from there. Unfortunately, finding a Rita in there is a little bit problematic because they're only listed as Mr. and Mrs. and so forth. There's no Christian names attached. So they have to find the survivors of the Lusitania that reside in London that are women and just go through them one by one. And that's exactly what they do. So the first stop, they land at the Laurels at Glendower Road number 7, and they find that the lady's name of the house is Eleanor Jane Keith. It's a dilapidated place, and the servant said, "I thought perhaps as you'd come about the gas." Tommy thinking on his feet and basically saying, "We're with the voting register. Does a Mrs. Keith reside here?" Very well. Christian name? Excellent. Obviously, that was a dead end. I still kind of put it in the bullet point notes here just in case. "I thought perhaps as you'd come about the gas" was an interesting line there. I don't think that's actually going to wind up being anything, but I wanted to make a note of it. Next stops after they're, we just do a little summary as they're having lunch and eating some steaks. They find a Gladys Mary, a Marjorie, an unknown with a change of address that was a little bit of a dead end, an American named Sadie, and then they have 2 more options. And on the 6th option, they land at the South Audley Mansions, 2nd floor flat. And speaking with the servant there, they come to find that the name of the lady of the flat is Marguerite Vandermeyer. At which point Tommy gets another idea and says, "Wait, Marguerite, what about Rita?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, everybody calls her Rita, but her Christian name's Marguerite." So they are giddy. Tommy goes over and greets Tuppence, who is just happy as a clam. Unfortunately, the mood changes very quickly as she shoves him in the shadows real quick and 2 men descend the stairs. At which point she says, "Tommy, go follow them. I don't want to be recognized and I don't know who the other one is, but that first one, that's Whittington." So it would appear that a chapter that started out with a trail run cold, through Tuppence's cleverness, they actually managed to make some decent headway. Not only finding out who Rita was, but inadvertently stumbling across the nature of the first clue in finding out where Whittington is. So let's find out what happens next in chapter 7. We're really in the intrigue now. So this is turning from investigation into a full-on spy thriller, and this chapter in particular really put its foot on the gas pedal. So Tommy is in full pursuit of both men, going up and down streets and so forth until finally they arrive at the restaurant Lions, and Tommy takes the table next to theirs, out of view of Whittington, but in view of the second man that wouldn't recognize him. Even Whittington probably wouldn't recognize him, but why take the risk? Tommy not taking a risk, that we'll get to. So over the din of the restaurant, Tommy really wasn't able to make out a whole lot of the conversation between the 2 men. They were kind of talking a little bit close to one another, not really revealing a whole lot, playing it, well, intelligently, just in case somebody's eavesdropping. But nevertheless, he does pick up on a few words: Ireland, propaganda. And then in a lull of the background noise, he actually manages to pick up, but you don't know Flossie. She's a marvel. An archbishop would swear she was his own mother. She gets the voice right every time, and that's really the principal thing. In which the reply came, of course, only in an emergency. So the man that Whittington refers to as Boris goes on to talk and eventually brings up Mr. Brown and talks about how enigmatic he is, questions whether he even exists and so forth. And then after a little while, they pay the bill and leave. Tommy follows suit and follows them to the train station. They actually managed to do a little cab, follow that cab thing, and seemed to delight him, if not the driver. So once they get to the train station, Whittington buys a first-class train ticket for 3:30, half an hour from then, to Bournemouth. And Tommy also gets a ticket, but then he kind of realizes, well, shoot, if he only got one ticket, these men are going to eventually part ways, and then who do I follow? So Tommy thinks on his feet, calls Hersheimmer, and gets a second pair of shoes to follow when Boris and Whittington part ways. He basically says, Hersheimmer, get down here. There's stuff going on, and you want to be a part of it. So that's exactly what happened. Hersheimmer arrives just in time, and Tommy instructs him, you follow Whittington, I'll follow Boris. Once that happens, Boris takes the tube, does some more walking until he finally arrives at a house in a cul-de-sac in Soho. And in that cul-de-sac, Tommy observes Boris give a little bit of a rhythmic knock, a particular pattern, say a few words to the person that answered the door, and then enter. So instead of doing the most common sense thing, Tommy takes all leave of his senses, all leave of intelligence, and rushes over to the house, gives the same rhythmic knock, And when the door gets answered, he can't think of anything to say other than Mr. Brown, which grants him entry. He's told upstairs. What the hell is Tommy doing? This is getting out of hand, certainly. The whole situation had been getting out of hand, but this really ramps it up to 11. And the next chapter is the adventures of Tommy. So I'm very curious to see how Tommy fares in think on his feet kind of situation without Tuppence present to ground him or honestly to goad him into further adventures. It seems like they kind of a little bit of a codependent relationship of steamrolling each other into bad ideas that somehow turn out okay, mostly. So yeah, Tommy on his own, that's going to be an interesting one. So that's actually something that between the two, Tuppence seems to have the intelligence. She's figuring out what clues are what, how to interpret them, what next moves to make, whereas Tommy is a little bit better about thinking on his feet. And I have a feeling that whatever situation he's going to be winding up in chapter 8 is that's going to serve him well. I think that there's going to be some fine examples of Tommy thinking on his feet. And this whole thing has been fascinating just from an example of these two people that are not part of this world, have no information, no experience, no clues, no money, and are somehow able to just flapjack themselves. I don't know what even that means, but just completely insert themselves naturally and with measures of success into this world and wind up on top somehow. So will chapter 8 follow suit, or is Tommy way over his head in a way that he's not going to be able to get out of? You're going to read, I'm going to read, we're going to read, and then we will meet back up in just a moment to find out what happens in chapter 8. So this is looking like a case where Tommy's luck holds out until it doesn't. So this is a chapter that didn't have a whole lot of action going on in it, but it did have a whole lot of reveals in Tommy being a spy, hiding away from the door adjacent to where he was basically, shrouded, and watching as people started coming upstairs to the big villain meeting. And this has caused the board to get updated with a lot of new characters. So one of the first people that come up the stairs gave a rhythmic knock upstairs as well. When the door opened, asked for the number, he said number 14 and then was allowed entrance. And everybody that came after him gave their number. We didn't get any number higher than 14, and it looks like there were already some people in the room, but overall, I'm going to say that 14 people were in there. And the reason I'm going to say that is because with that number, I have dubbed this group the Fortnight Felons. So we have Boris there. I also did include the doorman of the Soho house, villainous-faced man with close cropped hair. And the reason that I'm including him is because I'm not convinced that that's not Mr. Brown. And even if it's not, I also think that it's going to play a small role in the chapter to follow, because Tommy's not out of danger. He's certainly not out of the house, not by a long shot. So whenever we pick back up with Tommy, this doorman might have something to do with it. So I definitely included him. But we have Boris, who we've already talked about. Number 14, British man, criminal jaw, looks tough. The number taker, the person that was already sitting there at the head of the table asking people for their numbers, close cropped hair, navel looking beard, German accent. Then one of the people that come up was an Irish Sinfiner. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know a whole lot of the history behind it, but looking at the wiki, it looks like a whole big political thing. I apologize. I know that that's very, very ignorant and simplistic of something that is likely quite sensitive and complicated. But yes, the Irish individual that came up the stairs, somebody that Tommy said looked like a city clerk, someone that was unknown but looked somewhat familiar to Tommy, followed immediately by somebody else that is also unknown but looks somewhat familiar to Tommy, only this person has a commanding appearance and is exquisitely dressed. And then the last entrance there turned out to be number 1. Small man, very pale, possibly Slavic, reminded Tommy of a venomous snake and has a Russian accent. So, going into the events of chapter 8 here, it was mostly just Tommy hiding and observing, and we really don't get to the meat of a whole lot until we get to the conversation itself. So by the time that Tommy actually made his way into the adjoining bedroom, got a door open a crack, and was able to listen to the conversation, that's when we started getting a flood of information. So he overhears talks of using the Irish miners, railways, and other labor forces to upend the British Empire, basically taking the concept of these workers that are not happy with the way the government is being run, not happy with their jobs, not happy with the social situation that's happened in the wake of World War I, and are on the precipice of striking. They have not yet, but this group seems to want to push them over the edge, cause instability, cause doubt in the government, and use them as honest men to kick things off for dishonest purposes, that they will be useful tools in whatever nefarious schemes that the fortnight felons have going on here. The date, the 29th. We don't really have like a timeline baked into this as far as what day of what month things are happening, so that's a little bit nebulous. All we do know is that it's a close date. We'll just have to see, how close that may be. Climbs must go. He is too far seeing. Number 14 will see to that. We don't know who Climbs is yet. Totally unknown character, but definitely want to make a point of bullet pointing that one. And then the conversation shifts to the treaty as one of the elements that number 1 wants to use as that final push in causing doubt and instability in the British Empire for those labor forces to strike. So now we know generally what their reasoning is for wanting it. In terms of what they plan to do in any kind of terrorist fashion or government overthrow fashion once the strike does happen, that's a little bit we're still pretty foggy on that one, but nevertheless, the treaty is an important part of this. It will give that final push that's needed because the workers at this point, although they're discontent, they still have an allegiance, they still have some faith in the government, and this will drive that wedge between them. And in this conversation about the treaty, it is revealed that nobody in this group actually has it yet, but they do know of a girl that does. Whether or not that's Jane, we will see. I don't know, but a girl does. And before the location of that girl is revealed, Tommy gets knocked out with a blow to the head from behind. We are at a little bit where I feel like I can add to the board in terms of, I know this isn't a mystery quite yet. I mean, it kind of is, it kind of isn't. It certainly isn't a whodunit. We're not taking elements of an event that happened and then deconstructing it through the lens of the future by going through past accounts to really tear things apart and find the layers underneath, but rather we're just going through a linear story. But there are still questions to be asked. There are still mystery elements in play here. So I wanted to add to the board and get some of those questions down. Now, right now, this is very rudimentary. I have more questions than this, but this is what I'm putting down for right now. Where is Jane Finn? Where is the treaty? And who is Mr. Brown? But you know where we will find those answers for absolute certain? The rest of the book. So let's get to reading chapter 9, Tuppence enters domestic service. So it looks like Tuppence is also getting in over her head, albeit with slightly less catastrophic results, at least in the most immediate sense. We did add some new characters to the board here. Most notably, we have little Albert, the little boy that Tuppence tricks into believing that she is a detective hot on the heels of Rita, the emerald thief. So, I thought that was a really lovely, cute interaction that they had. This was a little bit of a longer chapter just in terms of actual page count, but it didn't feel like a whole lot happened in action. And a good portion of this was spent in, the kind of the close quarters, the character interactions between each other. And I think the big bulk of that was between Tuppence and Albert. And I honestly, I loved that so much, the way that she was taking him into her confidence. And also when the situation kind of presented himself of putting him in further danger, she pulled back and said, no, let's not do that. I admired that. I also updated the picture here for Rita Marguerite Vandermeer. Now that we have an idea of what she actually looks like with the blonde hair and the striking sharp features, the bit of an ominous tone to everything there. So just going over the summary of the chapter here, we have Tuppence meets Albert, tricks him into her confidence, convinces him that she's a detective on the trail of the Emerald Thief Rita, and also convinces him to put in a word for her to replace the newly sacked house parlor maid so that she can go undercover. Tuppence then leaves and gets herself the clothes, hair, etc. to fit the part, and sends a message to Carter to get details established as far as the undercover alibi or, persona. And then wonders, well, where is Tommy? Where is anybody right now? They should have been back by now. It's a bit of, internal dialogue as far as a bit of worry going on and hoping that everything's going to be all right. And then the next morning she wakes up and finds a message from Carter once again saying that, nobody would blame you if you were to stop doing this right now. Nobody would blame you if you were to back out. This is a dangerous situation. These are very dangerous people, and it's okay. But if you still want to go through with it, first of all, we've established the previous employer of Mrs. Dufferin, the parsonage Lanolly, to use as a reference for this character. Once again, advises Tuppence caution. If you do decide to go through with this, please be careful, so on and so forth. And of course, that's not even a question to her. Of course she's going to go through with it. So she puts on the disguise, goes back to the flat, and finally meets with Mrs. Vandemeyer. And gets the job, gives the name Prudence Cooper and gets the job. I loved the interaction or the reaction that Tuppence had to Mrs. Vandemeyer, because they've been thrust into all sorts of very odd and ominous, dangerous situations dripping with potential violence and foreboding. But this is the first time that she actually seems kind of shaken up in meeting somebody, that this person does exude a sense of danger about them. So I do want to just say that in a couple of chapters, it's not going to be right now, I'm going to pin this for the moment, but in a couple of chapters, I do kind of want to start coming up with some grander theories as far as the overall nature of what's going on here. And the one question that I haven't been able to get out of my head, I put on the board here, and it goes beyond generally what, the easy stuff. Who's Mr. Brown? Where's the treaty? Where's Jane Finn? And it gets into more deep stuff, because we're starting to get an idea of who Mr. Brown is in this underworld of criminal activity. We're also starting to get an idea of what they want the treaty for in the disruption of the British government. Where is Jane Finn? That's going to be the question for the book. But the one question that I have that I haven't been able to get unsplintered from my brain is this one. Why did Mr. Brown want somebody posing as Jane Finn in the French boarding school? They had the meeting with Tuppence. They wanted her to put on the American accent. They were eventually going to have her have the name of Jane Finn. What is the purpose of having somebody pretending to be Jane Finn at this boarding school? Who is supposed to observe that? What is that supposed to accomplish? I'm very curious about that. And I think I'm going to let a couple of chapters simmer before I start coming up with some grand theories. Right now, the only theories that I have kind of shake up all of the characters and kind of put them all on their head, which may turn out to be exactly how this all goes. But I'm going to save that for the moment. And in the meantime, we're just going to get right on to reading chapter 10. So I'll talk to you in just a little bit. So now we have met Sir James Peel Edgerton. One of the things that I enjoy about not only reading these books, but also doing this breakdown, kind of really looking at things individually, is the opportunity to learn new things. If I was just reading this, by myself, just kind of before bedtime, I don't know that I would have done the legwork in tracking down some of the acronyms and so forth, or anything more specific to the time and place of this novel that is foreign to me, would I do that research. But Sir Peel Edgerton is a KC. That's an example. I probably would have just, okay, well, that's something important. Okay, so he's an important man. For this, I actually do want to really look into this. So KC means King's Counsel, which is the highest form of barrister or lawyer. So to start out, Tuppence is working for Mrs. Vandemeyer, doing the job that, she's already basically been trained to do. So this is right within her wheelhouse, even, during the war effort. and just kind of picks up on a few things along the way. Number one is that the cook is very scared of Mrs. Vandermeyer for no known reason. Certainly there could be the reason of the same feeling that Tuppence has when interacting with Mrs. Vandermeyer, that kind of nervous, scared quality, but it seems like the cook is scared for a very specific reason. It's less vague and more truly, genuinely not just nervous, but scared. Boris then comes over and gets announced as Count Stepanov. And when he's meeting with Rita, he asks her, what about the new girl? You know, like, can she be trusted? Things like that. And Rita says, oh, yeah, she's fine. She's the cousin of the downstairs boy that works in the elevator or something. So, you know, the ruse has worked, at least as far as we're concerned, at least as far as Tuppence is concerned. And then during the private conversation, once the door gets closed, Tuppence can't hear anything through the doors. So she manages to find a way to make her way into the adjoining room, out that window, and then kind of underneath the boudoir window where it was cracked, and she's able to listen to it from the outside. So she was able to pick up on that portion of the conversation. And during that, Boris is not pleased with Mrs. Vandermeyer. He's complaining of her going everywhere with Peel Edgerton. And that's where we got to get explained that he's a King's Counsel, that he is a specialist in criminology. And then he asks her, be guided by me and give up Peel Edgerton, at which, you know, yeah, she's like, nah, I'm good. She's basically talking along the lines of that the place that he has in court could actually be advantageous to her, not necessarily to them. She seems to be operating in a way that is very, I don't know about selfish, but in her own best interests more than anything else. And Boris alludes to this by saying, you know, we're at the right price, you'd sell us all out. And like, well, that price would have to be pretty high. This is generally joking that, yeah, there is a price. And he wasn't very keen on that joke at all. So at that point, they ring for drinks and Tuppence heads back in a hurry. And the next day, Rita arranges for Tuppence to have the day out. And before her last chore of polishing the silver is done, the doorbell rings, and it is Sir James Peel Edgerton himself. He comes through, is eyeballing Tuppence. She's like feeling his eyes pierce through her. He stays for about 15 minutes, and on the way out, he has a wonderful little interaction with her. Oh, you're new here? You know, there's a lot of good jobs out there. Might be worth broadening your horizons elsewhere. Just generally, you know, like, you should probably leave. It's just a hint and a suggestion. And the question that's on my mind is he making this suggestion to a new housekeeper? Or is he making this suggestion to somebody that he recognizes is operating under the radar for other purposes? If he is everything that Boris has talked him up to be, it most certainly would be the latter, that he sees through Tuppence, doesn't quite understand exactly under what umbrella she's operating, but that she is certainly not there just as a housekeeper, and that maybe whoever she's spying on, this particular flat and this particular person just isn't worth the risk. So not a whole lot to report on the character front, but I did add a few new things here. So we got the cook, we got Sir Peel Edgerton, and I did come up with some links between a few of the characters. There's really nothing groundbreaking happening yet, and we will see what happens here in chapter 11. So let's go ahead and get to reading, and we'll catch back up. Julius tells a story indeed. So Tuppence now goes for her afternoon out, confirms that there are no messages waiting for her at the stationer's, then goes back to the Ritz and finds that, much to her dismay, Tommy still isn't around. She writes a letter to Mr. Carter basically telling him what they've done so far and asking him for aid in any way he can, which I'm not sure how much he'd be able to provide. This is kind of along the lines of, well, they haven't been captured, but even so, you know, he did kind of say, you know, resources for help would be limited. There is a little bit of, you're putting yourself in danger, don't say I didn't warn you kind of element. Regardless, she then asks about Mr. Hersheimmer, who is told that he returned about 30 minutes prior and immediately left again, who then bursts back in, astounded that Tommy had still not yet been heard from. And then he tells his story, where he followed Whittington on the train from Waterloo to Bournemouth, followed him from the station to a hotel and booked a room alongside him. And then about 9 o'clock that night, Whittington left by car and then by foot to a dark house, and Julius followed him. All the ground floor windows were shuttered, but the window upstairs had a light on, a candlelight with curtains drawn, but it could still be seen. Julius then attempted to climb a tree opposite the window to peer inside, which was a little tricky considering that everything was wet and, well, climbing a tree. It can pose risks. But he does indeed see Whittington inside. Some kind of fidgeting, getting repositioned and so on. But he sees that Whittington was not only inside, but he was also talking to a woman who couldn't see her face, couldn't hear anything of the conversation, but he did see that she was dressed as a nurse. And about the time that one of them was looking out the window, the branch broke and Julius takes a tumble. He then wakes up at that same house in a bed being tended to by a different nurse. And then Dr. Hall comes in, tells him he sprained his ankle, and is generally wondering, hey, what the hell were you doing out there, buddy? He then made up a story about a girl, guardianship, nervous breakdown, etc., and asked if a Jane Finn was there, and Dr. Hall confirms, no, she's not. He then inquired about Whittington, and Hall says that he was there to visit Nurse Edith, who is his niece, and Nurse Edith is also no longer around. She left that night with a patient. So he writes a letter to Tommy, doesn't hear back, and when he's healed up a bit, he leaves. Tuppence then catches Julius up with what she's been doing, and he basically says, okay, well, let's get to the bottom of this. Let's try to get back on track of this whole Boris situation. We obviously don't know where he and Tommy went, but we do know that he was seen at the Audley Mansions. So why don't I go ahead and buy a car, and I'll wait outside of the mansions. You flag me. If he returns, you tell me who he is, and we can go from there. We can follow him at the very least from that point. So says, okay, what kind of car you want? And she says, Rolls Royce. And he says, okie dokie, no problem. He goes out and 35 minutes later returns with a Rolls Royce that he bought off of a bigwig. So she is completely entranced with his elaborate spending and so forth, his boisterous lifestyle. So at this point, I don't really have a theory in terms of grand overall elements of what's actually going on, but I do kind of just want to come up with a few general ideas. So the biggest one that I have is we have two allies in the corner of Tommy and Tuppence right now. We have Carter and we have Julius P. Hersheimmer. And I don't think it's entirely unreasonable to think that one or the other or both are not what they appear. And if I had to put any kind of money on it, I would say there's pros and cons in each column. First of all, Julius P. Hersheimmer, it does have the boisterous element of the personality, which can be seen as almost a purposefully magnetic element. He's spending all over the place, just the kind of person that Tommy and Tuppence might gravitate toward, which could be a very purposeful thing. And there's also the element of the fact that when they went out to answer the ads, well, the ad that had been answered in terms of finding out where or if anybody had ever heard of a Jane Finn, she got the two responses, one from Carter, one from Hersheimmer. And they went to Carter first, and it made a specific point of mentioning that they forgot to tell Carter about the second correspondence, the one that they were about to go to, which wound up being Hersheimmer. And it makes me kind of wonder, what would Carter have done if he had had that information? Would it be a situation where if Carter is on the up and up and he is a member of the intelligence community, would he have recognized the danger inherent or possibly even followed them or recognized Hersheimmer? Would it have been a moment of caution had they told him? And if not, well, why did make a specific point of telling us about that lack of information? Little suspect there. And then the whole story about trying to find his cousin with a side of the family that wasn't talking. I'm not saying it's not possible. It just seems a little bit flimsy in terms of everything else that's going on right now with the international intrigue and the espionage and the attempting to overthrow governments. Just this happen to be millionaire or at least rich, wealthy individual that is just happen to be tracking down family members that are estranged. I don't know. It seems, yeah, flimsy, I guess is the best word to put it. Then we have Carter. And I don't really have anything specifically to point out in terms of why I would suspect him, other than the fact that he has been helpful, which is immediately suspicious in my mind. And we also haven't really heard a whole lot from him. Reading the Agatha Christie novels that I have so far, oftentimes I've found that the person that should be looked at with the most scrutiny is the person that is often glossed over the most, the person that has not had that scrutiny. So the fact that he hasn't really been there, but the only thing that really kind of draws that into question for me is the fact that Tommy did recognize him. So maybe he was a member of the intelligence community. Maybe Tommy did recognize him from his days in, working in the war. So there's a little bit of a softly verifiable level of character involved here. If I had to put any kind of money on which one of these two are not what they appear, or even just going even further than that and saying that they are actually nefarious in one way or another, I would have to say I am not trusting Hersheimmer. There's something about him. The magnetic personality, the boisterous spending, the flimsy story, the wanting to help, which in and of itself can be seen as suspicious. Yeah, I'm suspecting Hersheimmer, but I have a feeling the whole concept of Julius tells a story, well, I interpreted that as Julius spins a yarn. I don't necessarily believe anything that he just said, but we will see. Let's continue on with chapter 12 and find out more about what's going to be happening with all of these characters. Wow. Okay. So a whole lot going on here so far. And we start out with something that I kind of expected. A few days pass, still no sign of Tommy. And of course, Mr. Carter does answer, can't really help you. I mean, this is kind of what I warned you about. You didn't have to take this on, which does kind of get a little bit addressed later on in the chapter. But, yeah, it's a little bit shitty to enlist their help, even with the caveats of there could be danger. And if there is, I can't help. At the very least, everything else aside, Mr. Carter at least seems to have been very upfront about that possibility. So, yeah, there is that. So Tuppence finally starts to feel the weight of all of this. The romance, the grandeur, the adventure has started to lose its luster, and she's starting to kind of realize this is serious. This actually could be something that is dangerous or even deadly. And, that's a lot of weight to all of a sudden have placed on the shoulders. And in my mind, I think that should have been felt a whole lot earlier. But that's just me. Regardless, she's feeling it now, especially with Tommy being gone. So with Boris nowhere to be seen, the stakeout hasn't really been very fruitful at all. She manages to convince Julius that they need to go see Sir James Peel Edgerton. Apparently Julius wasn't really on board with that, but it took some convincing, and finally he relented, and she's like, what harm could it do? And there's not really a good answer to that. So yeah, okay, fine. We'll go see. So they have the meeting with Sir James Peel Edgerton. Once they get in, they get past the butler, and they kind of get there on sort of false pretenses somewhat, but regardless, they do manage to make it into the meeting, and they discussed the earlier warning that James gave Tuppence when he was leaving Mrs. Vandemeyer's estate. Now, I said earlier, I wasn't sure whether James was giving that warning to just the new girl that was helping out at the flat, or if he saw something more in Tuppence, that she was perhaps operating in a covert manner there and offering the warning based on that. And it appears it was the former, just a new staff member, and kind of even saying that, I wouldn't want anybody close to me working in that environment. So yeah, if one were to take it as a warning, then so be it. And based on this and the friendly nature of everything, Tuppence goes ahead and tells him the whole story. So now at this point, we have the whole story being given to Julius, to Mr. Carter, and to Sir James Peel Edgerton. And given the events that happened shortly after this, it kind of puts potentially all of them into the shadow of suspicion. We'll get to that in a minute. So James appears inclined to help. He seems like an upstanding dude, just a lawyer that's operating on more than just a litigious level and is actually wanting to bring justice to the world and lock up any criminals that may be threatening that. So based on the notion of once the whole story was out, that this could be something that leads to more and is something that could crack open a much larger, grander scheme. Yes, he is inclined to help in the small way of Tuppence and Tommy's plight. So he says that he can convince Mrs. Vandermeyer to reveal Tommy's whereabouts if she knows them by asking questions, and then if not by force, then by bribery. At which point Julius chimes in and says, "Hoo-hoo, that's where I come in. Oh yes, sir, I can offer a reward of $1 million for information relating to Tommy, Jane, Mr. Brown, etc." At which point James is kind of eyeing him with scrutiny, like, $1 million? Really? Which is a suspicious amount. It's suspiciously high, especially for that era. He has oodles of money and he's willing to throw it around for this purpose of tracking down his cousin, that it's worth this much to him. So plans develop for James to appear at 10 o'clock that evening, with Tuppence coming back a bit earlier at 9:30. So she could get there earlier, but don't do it on his account. That, they don't want her raising suspicions. If she's going to be back there, it needs to look organic. Tuppence and Julius at that point, they leave the meeting and then they part ways. Tuppence says she wants to go through a stroll in the park, and Julius says he needs to get some petrol and send a few cables. So Tuppence at that point decides, after not going to really have the good meal that James, well, at least not yet. She wants to just take a look at the house. She wants to take a look at the flat that Mrs. Vandermeyer is staying in, I guess just to see the outside of it. I don't know. That one seemed a little flimsy on a narrative point of view, but regardless, it's a good thing she did, because as soon as she's within eyesight, Albert runs after her and says, Miss, she's a-going, as in Mrs. Vandermeyer is packing up and getting out quick. So Tuppence informs Albert, ring up the Ritz, inform Julius of what's going on, and to get James there immediately. And at that point enters the building and plans on kind of, getting back into the maid swing of things and somehow subversively detaining Mrs. Vandermeyer. But Mrs. Vandermeyer is there to greet her and greets her quite coldly, says that the cook is out, and then mid-conversation presses a gun against Tuppence's head. At this point, not only does Mrs. Vandermeyer know that somebody's onto her and she needs to make a quick exit, she knows that Tuppence is a part of it. Otherwise, she would just, well, help me pack. Like, clearly there's some knowledge going on there of Tuppence's involvement. So, we really do kind of need to pull back and look at who has this information, who has the information of who Tuppence is in relation to this flat and Mrs. Vandermeyer, and who would have told her that. And in my mind, it's kind of one of two people that get addressed a little bit later down the line. The third that I kind of have in mind would be Mr. Carter, but that doesn't really enter into it so much, just because he may have the information of Tuppence's involvement in this whole situation. And that may be passed along to Mrs. Vandermeyer, but that would not create the necessary urgency for her to want to leave immediately. There's something that's happening that she knows about that is going to be happening very soon, and she needs to pack now. So yeah, that kind of brings it down to just one of two people in my mind. Possibly three. I'll get into that in a little bit. Gun to Tuppence's head. The situation is now very dire indeed. And she tries to get Tuppence to drink a sleeping aid so she can just make her exit without having to get any kind of nastiness involved there. And Tuppence is refusing, fearing a deadly poison, which is it's a valid fear. I get it. And apparently so did Mrs. Vandermeyer. It's like, I get it, but what can we do to assuage this fear and just get her to drink this damn glass? So Tuppence is throwing a fit and then uses that opportunity to throw the fluid into Mrs. Vandermeyer's face and quickly grabs the sitting gun. The tables have now turned. Oh, yes, indeed. And now with the upper hand, Tuppence takes control of the conversation and offers £100,000 for information on Jane Finn, Boris, Mr. Brown, and Tommy. And, after a little bit of back and forth, it's like, you don't have £100,000. And it's like, well, no, I don't, but I know someone that does. And a little bit of convincing, but Mrs. Vandermeyer starts to kind of buy it. It's like, okay, well, this may actually happen here. And we're kind of hearkening back to the whole situation of the argument that Boris and Mrs. Vandermeyer had, where he was kind of tongue-in-cheek, kind of not, talking about, what kind of price would it take for you to sell us out? And she's like, oh, we'll see. So at this point, Mrs. Vandermeyer does reveal she doesn't know where Jane Finn is, but she could find out easily. She also doesn't know anything about Tommy, but says, I can ask Boris, and, if he knows, he'll say. And then gets into the Mr. Brown situation. Says nobody knows who Mr. Brown is. And Tuppence isn't buying it. Says that Mrs. Vandermeyer is maybe the one person on Earth that does. And at that point, she relents, admits that yes, she does, and then gets very fearful, basically saying, leave my name out of it. Can I have your assurances? Can I have your assurances for anonymity, for the money, so on and so forth? Is very clearly frightened about the whole situation. She's about to spill the beans on something that is a very protected secret. And then gets out the words, you don't know him, he's, shrieks with terror, points over Tuppence's head, and faints. And Tuppence turns around and sees Sir James Peel Edgerton and Julius Hersheimmer, who in my mind, aside from James's butler, whom they had to get past for that meeting, and I'm not really eyeballing that quite yet. Maybe I should, because that was the situation where at the very first meeting with Whittington, it was his employee that actually proved to be Mr. Brown. So, this may be a situation where we do need to be looking at the people that we're not really supposed to be, that, the folks that are kind of in the background, just simply opening the door and announcing the person and then, exiting the scene. Maybe they do need to have some light shed on them. But right now, aside from the potential butler situation, we are looking at Sir James Peel Edgerton and Julius P. Hersheimmer as kind of not necessarily Mr. Brown, but somebody that is way more involved with this than the surface level of their character being presented would indicate. The only reason I don't think that either of those two are Mr. Brown himself is that Tuppence did see that assistant at Whittington's office. And although he kind of seemed like an average nondescript person, I can't help but think that Tuppence would recognize him. Most certainly in these meetings, and also just kind of being nondescript. Hersheimmer is a big, large man, bold, brash, so on, and doesn't really fit that nondescript, average build kind of persona. So we have a few different possibilities here. Either they're involved and not Mr. Brown, or they're potentially Mr. Brown and the assistant from Mr. Whittington was not actually Mr. Brown himself and was just kind of alluded to. We are really in the thick of it with the action and suspicions and intrigue and all the espionage and the whole bit. I don't really have any more updates on theories aside from the men that were standing in the doorway are suspicious in their own right, and toward what end, I don't think they are Mr. Brown. I just think that they are involved, or one of them is involved, and that is enough that it caused Mrs. Vandermeyer to faint. Either that or it's something else entirely. We'll see in chapter 13. So I'm going to go ahead and read that, and we'll catch back up in just a moment. All right, so chapter 13 is under our belts. Some of the things that I had questions on did get kind of addressed, and some of the things that I predicted might happen as I was reading the chapter most certainly did. So let's get into the synopsis real quick here, because I have some theories I would like to share. So first thing that happens is Sir James rushes over to Mrs. Vandermeyer, called for brandy, and Julius runs out to grab it. At that point, Julius is, checking up on her, feeling her pulse, says that she's touch and go, which I love the 1920s medical logic going on here. Somebody's pulse is touch and go. Quick, she needs booze. Anyway, Julius does come back after some time with the brandy. They administer it, and sure enough, she slowly does come around, weak and resting. So Tuppence then fills the two men in on the immediate events that just happened as far as Mrs. Vandemeyer's near identification of Mr. Brown, which they interrupted. They talk about the walls have ears and the possibility of a dictaphone in the room or in the flat of some sort. So they recommend holding a vigil. Basically, let's let her rest, get a good night's sleep, and we will go ahead and watch over her and make sure nothing happens to her. Where Tuppence will basically, rest, and the duties of the vigil will be shared between Sir James and Julius. Before exiting, Mrs. Vandemeyer does weakly whisper to Tuppence, "Don't leave," what sounded like sleepy, and then Mr. Brown before closing her eyes. Tuppence then exits. Sir James instructs her to lock the door from the outside just to make sure nobody else can get in. And then Julius goes and says that he is going to inform Albert of generally what's going on, at least put his mind at ease, and does just that. Returns a few minutes later, says he put the boy's mind at ease and compensated him very nicely for his troubles, as Julius is wont to do. So after that, they have a meal. Tuppence fills them in on the rest of what had happened, the events leading up to things. And Julius is concerned about what tipped off Mrs. Vandemeyer. It's exactly kind of what I was wondering at the end of the last chapter. Obviously something had made her act in a manner of real urgency there. So the discussion continues on, and it naturally leads back to Julius's adventures climbing the tree outside of Dr. Hall's place. And Sir James proffers the idea that, she could have been there just under a different name. You only asked for Jane Finn, and they said no Jane Finn here. Julius actually mentioned the name of Dr. Hall for apparently the first time, which triggered something in Sir James's memory. He said, "Oh, well, that's, Dr. Hall? That's a coincidence. I just saw him this morning at the Metropole," which I'm assuming is a hotel or a restaurant or something of the sort. But yeah, had known of Dr. Hall on and off for a few years, but it sounds like the idea of actually just like bumping into him was a rare event. So the fact that it happened coincidentally that day, sometimes there are no such thing as coincidences. So then Tuppence finally goes to sleep and then wakes the next morning feeling refreshed, finds Julius standing vigil, and then takes the key out of her pocket to bring Mrs. Vandemeyer tea, enters the bedroom. She's dead. Obviously. That one we saw coming a million miles away. So then they muse about how it could have happened, start inspecting the room. They called for a doctor, and they find a safe on the wall with the key inside. Julius opens it, takes some time, and then after some time says, "Well, it's empty." Then the young doctor arrives, said it was her heart, but there was chloral in the air, like a sleeping agent. And then Tuppence remembers, oh, wait, that bottle that Mrs. Vandemeyer tried to dose her with, basically it's like, go to sleep, let me leave. There's no harm that's going to come to you. But she runs to check on the bottle, and what was nearly full is now completely empty. So that's the events of the chapter. Again, I kind of figured that if Mrs. Vandemeyer hadn't died, about the time that the vigil started and they were locking the room from the outside, I'm like, oh, she dead. So in terms of my suspicions and my culprits and so forth, I just have some kind of throwing stuff at the walls theories here going on. First of all, Julius is highly suspicious at this point. As far as Julius bringing up the idea of what put Mrs. Vandemeyer into such a rush, my mind does kind of go back to this portion right here in chapter 12, where Tuppence and Julius leave the meeting with Sir James Edgerton and then part ways. In terms of my suspicions of anybody, Julius is kind of on the top of the heap. He said he needs to send a few cables. He needs to communicate with somebody. Whom might that be? He was delayed in getting the brandy. Why? He was delayed in working out that there was nothing in the safe. Why? Just opening up the safe would just be a cursory glance. 2 seconds, if that. Not half a second. Not even reaching inside. Just, it's empty. There's nothing in here. But instead, some time passes. He's rummaging around and then says nothing. There's a lot of very suspicious elements going on in here. So the questions that kind of arise at that point is, how did anybody get in if Tuppence had the only key? We're assuming she had the only key. We're also assuming that nobody took it off of her. We're assuming that nobody dosed her, just for sleeping measures, but that seems a little far-fetched. I would think that if somebody actually dosed her with a sleeping agent, that she wouldn't just come around and be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed like any normal morning. So I'm kind of discounting that, but say perhaps somebody did manage to do that. She was sleeping in the boudoir, which they did confirm the window to Mrs. Vandemeyer's bedroom was open and was only accessible up till the boudoir. So is it possible that somebody entered, snagged the key off of Tuppence while she was sleeping, exited? Well, they wouldn't exit through the window, would they? Well, I mean, they would open the door. They would open the door, possibly kill Mrs. Vandemeyer, leave through the window, back to the boudoir, put the key back, but then lock it again. Okay, so there's an order of operations here that I'm still not entirely firm on, clearly. But here's a few thoughts that I have as far as who Julius might be, because I'm still not convinced he's Mr. Brown. I'm more in line of thinking that perhaps Julius is an American agent. I don't see why we wouldn't possibly have multiple international intelligence agencies on the track of all of this. If we're talking about the end of World War I and the possibility of future uprising of Russians, Bolsheviks, or so on, and the instability of European nations, it would stand to reason that there would definitely be more than just one nation and their intelligence community involved. And Julius is, clearly American, but again, that could be a ruse. If he is an American operative, then he might be operating not necessarily in Mr. Brown's interest, but also not necessarily in the UK's interest, such as Mr. Carter or Mr. Edgerton, Sir Edgerton, apologies. So, it could be a situation of an American intelligence agency performing their own means. If there was information that was acquired from the safe, and Mrs. Vandemeyer was at that point a loose end that they didn't want intelligence to be shared, it stands to reason that perhaps she might be killed in that event, or at the very least, a means to an end in terms of getting to Mr. Brown a little bit above suspicion. I don't know. There's a lot going on. I seem to end all these chapters with, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving pieces here, but it's true. And I'm very curious to see what happens next in chapter 14. So let's get to reading, and we'll catch back up in just a moment. All right. So that definitely went some directions, didn't it? All right. So the crew decides to visit Dr. Hall. It's like the last loose thread they have to pull on. So after a brief little respite, they all head over to the Metropole and inquire about Dr. Hall, find him in short order, and then Sir James asks if he would be willing to give information if it's in regards to a testimony that they need to receive. Then he asks Dr. Hall if he has heard of Mrs. Vandemeyer, which at that point, Dr. Hall says, Mrs. Vandemeyer of 20 South Audley Mansions? I know her slightly. I'm sorry. Most of the people that I only know slightly, I certainly don't have their address memorized. I can't help but think that something's up with that. But then Sir James goes and asks, has Mrs. Vandemeyer dropped off a young woman in your care? Indeed, she has. A Janet Vandemeyer. And, okay, so now we know where Jane Finn is, or at the very least we know where that Dr. Hall has received her. And then he explains that, well, her testimony is not going to be any good to you. Sorry. And then after that, explains that she has amnesia from the incident on the Lusitania, that she has retained memories ever since then, but Nothing about her life, her name, anything prior to that. Didn't even speak her native tongue. And then explains that our memory could come back at any point, right quick. Sometimes it's a shock or a jolt that brings it back, at which point Julius makes a proposal that makes me think he has just lost his damn mind. Proposes the idea of recreating a Lusitania type aquatic maritime tragedy, basically staging an incident in which he has a boat, he has a submarine, people are running around, actors that are pretending the ship is sinking and trying to jolt something out of her to get her memory back. And then the chapter concludes with Dr. Hall saying, "Whoa, I thought you understood. She's no longer in my care." Okay, so that's the little cliffhanger that happened there. What a weird chapter this was overall. And it was so weird that I can't help but thinking that perhaps it wasn't weird at all. Let me explain. There's a lot that's happening here, and I don't think that any of it is what it presents itself to be on the surface level. The fact that Dr. Hall knows Mrs. Vandemeyer's address by heart, despite saying I know her slightly, is a little suspicious. I don't necessarily have suspicions on Dr. Hall right now, but there are elements that just aren't quite lining up perfectly. But moreover than that, the amnesia thing. I can't help but think that one of the big plots that was happening in this whole thing was Edward Whittington trying to enlist the help of Tuppence to place her in a French boarding school posing as Jane Finn. So we already know that there are people out there that are trying to place a Jane Finn somewhere that they can be seen. And again, that question really does come down to why, to what purpose? And the question that I have is, was Mrs. Vandemeyer doing this? Is the reason that Jane Finn, Janet Vandemeyer, whomever, has amnesia and can't remember the events of her life prior to that is because it's not actually her. It was somebody that was placed there as essentially like a parallel plan that Edward Whittington wanted to pull off with Tuppence. And if she didn't even speak the native tongue, perhaps, like, did she get somebody that was French and didn't speak English so that she couldn't actually relay information? Or so there's a lot that just isn't adding up. And it really does make me think that they are hot on the trail of somebody that was pretending to be Jane Finn under the name Janet Vandemeyer. I don't believe the amnesia thing for a second. Let me just put it that way. I think there's something else that is easily explained. And I also think that Julius is still not above board. I think that this whole thing about the staging things, I don't see it coming to fruition. I think it's a ruse that he is thinking on his feet and trying to be the bombastic American rich person that spares no expense and can get anything done. But in that ruse, he simply wants to flesh her out. Because if he's planning this elaborate thing, he's basically circumventing any kind of guards that Dr. Hall might be putting up, anything along the lines that might be a speed bump in his journey, and is like, no, get me in front of her and we'll make this happen. I'll cure her. I don't think he believes the amnesia thing either, but we'll see. But I think either way, he wants to simply just get at her for some reason. Yeah, we'll just have to see. But this is bonkers. This is like, if this amnesia staging a ship attack in the middle of the ocean thing actually turns out to be face value, then this book has turned a corner. We have gone down some wacky territory here, and we'll just have to see. So, I mean, that's all I got for this one. So let's go ahead. Let's move on. Let's move on and just see. Here we go. Okay, so this one was a little bit of a ride also. It seems like everything surrounding Julius is larger than life and extraordinarily unpredictable. But here we go, chapter 15. So we pick up with things with Dr. Hall revealing that no, Jane/Janet is not under his care. She left the same day Julius fell out of the tree, And it was only a couple hours afterward that the nurse that he talked about left with the patient. That patient was her. She's gone. So all other clues exhausted. Everything's kind of all done and wrapped up as far as any, leads or threads or anything else. So Sir James basically says, well, I'm done. I'm going to be going to Scotland like I planned. Sorry about this. And before he leaves, he does kind of talk to Tuppence a little bit. And he says, basically in a roundabout way, there may still be hope yet. There may still be work yet to do on this. So don't lose that hope. But in the meantime, don't reveal all you know, even to those you know best, which I've long suspected Julius. And it doesn't surprise me if he is half the lawyer or Casey or whatever that the book is implying. It doesn't surprise me at all that Sir James is extraordinarily suspicious of him as well, especially in light of what happened with Mrs. Vandermeyer. It's too much of a coincidence. There's just too many coincidences floating around, and he is that larger than life character, which can often be the misleading sleight of hand. Look at what my right hand's doing very bombastically while the left hand is actually doing the work. So yes, don't say anything. And Tuppence immediately takes him up on that. Julius gets or invites her into the car and asks, oh, did he just say something to you? And he's like, nope. So Julius and Tuppence then drive away. Julius taking the opportunity to explain he doesn't really like Sir James. It's just a personality conflict, something about him. They just don't work well together. And then continues on talking about finding Tommy. First he starts talking about, well, maybe I should just give up on this whole thing, go back to America and forget about the whole Jane Finn situation. And then Tuppence brings up, well, what about Tommy? I mean, that's still kind of an active card on the table that is an important one. And, we're all kind of in this together. We can't just leave a man behind if, we have to at least find out what happened to him. And he agrees, okay, yes, Tommy, we need to find out what. There's a brief bit of conversation that happened there about, are you in love with Tommy, essentially? And like, no, of course not, can't be. We're just friends, that's all. Which I actually kind of enjoyed the friendship. Me personally, I just don't think that every character set, especially male-female character set, needs to fall in love with each other. I'm perfectly happy with Tuppence and Tommy just being friends, but it kind of looks like that's not the direction this is going to go. What are you going to do? It's 1920s writing. Regardless, Tuppence denies it at first, and then Julius proposes marriage to her, which really does kind of put her on the spot. It even mentions calling her bluff, and that's exactly what it does. She was talking with Tommy really early in the novel about, I just need to find a man that's rich enough that I can marry him and just be completely, independent, but also financially secure and wealthy. And Julius is basically presenting to her that exact opportunity, and she's turning it down, which is an interesting bit of character development there. I mean, I still don't buy that Julius is an American millionaire that's just, exactly who he says he is. Within the confines of this conversation that's happening between him and Tuppence, that's essentially what's on the table for her to agree or disagree with. And she's disagreeing with it. She's saying, no, I don't want that. And it, kind of goes back and forth a little bit, turns awkward. By the time she gets back, she's exhausted, she's frustrated, and especially frustrated with herself because she starts really kind of ruminating on why she's declining this proposal and coming to the realization that, yes, she does actually love Tommy. Oh, drat. And then she comes to a startling revelation. We don't know what revelation, but it is a biggie. She was just thinking on the events that had recently happened, and all of a sudden, bam, a thought hit her. It couldn't be, but maybe it is. So she writes a note, she puts it in an envelope, knocks on Julius's door. He's not there, so she leaves the note on a table, and then back in her room, a page boy delivers a telegram to her from Tommy. If the book can put an exclamation point on it, so can I. Not really a whole lot to really kind of theorize on. This was a very kind of cut and dry situation of a very odd chapter in a what's turning out to be a bit of an odd book. And we'll just have to see how chapter 16 turns out. I'm very curious to see where this goes in the relationship with where Tommy has been over the last several chapters, what work Sir James is going to continue doing down the road, and who Julius actually is, because I'm certainly not buying it. And it kind of feels like as this whole situation starts to come up to the next few chapters and we start to really kind of flesh out where Tommy's been, catch up with his whole storyline, that is going to come to light. But we'll see. Chapter 16 awaits us both. So we pick up at the house in Soho, and we come to find that Tommy has indeed been knocked out and is laying on the couch of the room that he was spying on, everyone surrounding him except for number one, who is now gone. And find out that the doorman was the one that knocked him out, and his name is Conrad. All right. So Tommy at this point does what Tommy does best and thinks on his feet. And he basically just bluffs his way into complete overconfidence. And yeah, I'm not in any danger. Why should I be? I have the upper hand here. Very much, just BS's his way through the entire conversation as he's racking his brain on the inside, trying to figure out what he can say to get out of this and survive. So I really enjoyed this part of the character and how cool and confident he actually played it and how well it worked out, at least for the moment. He basically arranges a deal in exchange for his life that he can provide to them the Lusitania papers. And he also explains that he doesn't actually have them, nor does he know where they are, but he has a few leads and he has some information that they don't. So he can be put on the case and find them for them. There's a lot of hemming and hawing and peacocking going around the room for a while. So they confer and eventually they agree, but his investigation must be done by proxy. He is not to leave. He is not even to be chaperoned. He gives the instructions to them, and through that, the investigation occurs. And he is not happy about it, but I think that he kind of realizes that there's just simply no wiggle room in this. So he's like, all right, you're tying my hands, and this is going to bork things up pretty good, but if that's the way you insist this has to go. And then also insists on seeing Jane Finn, and they're very confused by that. Why? She can't answer any of your questions. And of course he doesn't know the whole amnesia thing, so he kind of again bluffs his way through things, this time not with enough information to really be extraordinarily coherent. So he just says, I just want to see her face as I ask her one question. That's all. I don't even need her to answer it. I just need to see her face. Little odd there, but I guess it was odd and enigmatic enough to actually work. And also freely admits, I didn't say I have every, you have more information than I do in some areas, but I have more information than you do in others. Trying to assuage their doubts that are starting to arise by having some holes appear in his story there, and eventually gets put into a windowless room where he is really kind of taking stock of his situation and again, trying to think on his feet and try to figure out the next move, whatever that next move may be. Just for a moment, I just kind of want to step back and not really theorize about the plot or the characters themselves, but just kind of do a little bit of commenting on this book. I'm enjoying this. I think it's been a fun ride, but so far, I think it's one of those both things can be true statements. Although I'm enjoying this is so far my least favorite Agatha Christie novel that I've read. It's just not capturing me like some of the others that I've poured through, and it really kind of is all over the place. There's something to be said for having characters branch off and their stories diverge, but it feels like we've been away from Tommy for a very long time now, and I'm glad that we're picking back up with him, but I do kind of question if we've had too much A plot and had B plot go completely stagnant. So we'll just have to see how that turns out. And then there's also the notion, perhaps, of a little bit of dramatic deflating that's happening, because we already know that somewhere in the future, down the line, Tuppence receives a telegram from Tommy. So one might suspect on the surface level that we know he makes it out of this whole situation. However, it is just a telegram. That's all we know right now. So that telegram could have come from anybody, just so long as they knew about Tommy and knew about Tuppence and is sending it in his name. But there's a lot more to kind of go over, and we're just going to have to see how things flesh out. Again, I am enjoying this, and I don't want to make it seem like I'm not. I'm very curious what chapter 17 is going to be revealing. I'm hoping it continues on with the Tommy storyline, just because we do have such a major time discrepancy happening, and it really does feel like B-plot needs to start catching up so that whenever a reconciliation might happen, that we're getting those pieces lined up so that that does indeed happen. So chapter 17 is up next. Let's get to reading and we'll catch back up. So we have indeed stuck with Tommy, and boy howdy did things really start taking off here. This was an action-packed wild ride of a chapter, and I am here for it. I loved this. So we start out with Tommy. He's now trapped. He's wondering when he'll eat next. Apparently he's quite hungry, and that's a thought that's on his mind, which, you know, considering he's at the mercy of his captors, there's no windows, there's only one door, it's locked. I mean, I guess it's a, you know, pretty important question to be asking, is like, at what point will food come through the door? And it turns out to be the next morning when he is served breakfast by Annette, a young French girl who seems to be sympathetic to his plight, at least a little bit, but at the same time is just way too afraid to help. She is the, I guess, caretaker / just general helper in the house, and largely seems to be somewhat loyal to it, still kind of on the fence about exactly where Annette winds up and everything. But it does kind of get me wondering if perhaps if the amnesia thing is holding true, if Annette is Jane Finn and just doesn't realize it, if they, you know, just told her a different, I don't know. That's a whole other thing here. But regardless, she doesn't know who Jane Finn is, but has heard the name around the house quite a bit. After that, Conrad shows up with number 14, ties up Tommy, and appears at this point to be on to his ruse, even going so far as to say, talking as though you were still at the Bloomin' Ritz, aren't you? So clearly they know who Tommy is. They know what his deal is, or generally what's going on, which to me begs the question that Tommy winds up asking later on as the chapter ends, who tipped them off? And again, I can't help but feel like Julius, with his taking time to send cables, taking time in the safe, generally being the bombastic, potentially sleight of hand behavioral characteristics, was the person that not only tipped off Mrs. Vandermeyer, but also this crew. But yeah, they're on to Tommy. They tie him up and then leave him to be dealt with the next morning. So he is there just tied up overnight. But before the night ends, Annette comes in, says she needs to take his tray. Oops, just by habit turned the light out, and then secretly puts a penknife in Tommy's hand and then leaves, locking the door behind her. During the night, Tommy takes the opportunity to cut his bonds and also apparently his wrist a little bit there, and waits for the morning. And the morning arrives. Conrad and number 14 walk in, and Tommy smashes a frame over number 14's head and escapes with Annette's help, leaving her behind at her apparent insistence. So Annette didn't really give herself up. She didn't reveal that she was helping Tommy, but surreptitiously, secretly gave him the instructions, just go. And the escape was actually really a rather fun one, you know, going up into the attic and then waiting behind the thing and then closing the attic with the string and knocking in a bunch of stuff over, causing everybody else to go up in the attic. And then you make your slip and then punching people as he goes out and gunfire is hailing around. Very exciting stuff. I'm coming back around to the secret adversary. Once he makes this escape and Tommy is now in safety, he goes ahead and cleans himself up and then has a meal, which does have me wondering, did they not like take the money off of his person? Where did he get any kind of fundage to go to a Turkish bath, get cleaned up, and have a meal? But we'll just gloss over that for the moment. And then while he's eating and recovering, he is reading a newspaper and sees an article about the Russian Bolshevism leader Kraminin, and recognizes him as number 1. So then Tommy basically goes to Whitehall, which I did have to look up, and Whitehall is apparently like this street in the UK that is just rife with government buildings. So it stands to reason this is a government building, whatever it may be here, and asks for Mr. Carter by his real name, which is still at this point unknown to readers. But we remember Tommy knew who he was and called upon him using his real name, and he wasn't terribly happy about that. But everything kind of got put aside when Tommy revealed exactly what had just been happening to him, and Carter is pretty enthralled with that, shows him some pictures, has Tommy identify some of the men that were at the house, And then they go back to the house together, which has now been abandoned as everybody predicted. After that, Tommy returns to the Ritz to reconnect with Tuppence and is told Miss Cowley had gone out just a quarter of an hour prior. At what point we are entering into things in the merging of the Tommy Tuppence storylines again? Not quite sure. Did she go out to have the final confrontation with Mrs. Vandermeyer? Not entirely certain. So we could still kind of be in the middle of things in Tuppence's covert operations. So it looks like we're going to find that out in chapter 18. And hopefully we're also going to start coming up with some revelations in terms of well, we seem to know who Mr. Carter is. That seems to be all on the up and up. If Tommy called upon him using his real name at his real place of work and he actually was there and it seems to be who he says he is, I'm pretty satisfied that Mr. Carter is as above suspicion as I am comfortably stating a character can be in an Agatha Christie novel. That is not entirely, but for the most part, I'm writing him off. Julius, still unknown. Sir James, still unknown. But of the two of those, Julius is by far the most suspicious. So I think that's who tipped everybody off, including Mrs. Vandermeyer, including the fortnight felons and everybody else involved with this. So chapter 18 awaits. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of what's going on with Jane Finn, with Tommy, with Tuppence, and with everybody else. Let's get to reading. So what once started as a comedy of errors as far as Tommy and Tuppence just falling ass backwards into the world of espionage and intrigue has instead turned into a comedy of errors with characters constantly just missing each other. So it goes with Tommy realizing that he has only missed Tuppence by about 15 minutes. And we realize now that we are completely caught up with each character's respective timeline. But at this point, for all Tommy knows, Tuppence just went out for a quick loaf of bread and she'll be back. So he's dining and then sees Julius and of course flags him down. This is a chapter that has a fair amount of dialogue as well as a large amount of time dispersed without actually having a ton really happening. That first bullet point captures a lot of dialogue there. Tommy and Julius catch up. Tommy talks about what he's been up to. Julius talks about what they've been up to. They catch up. At which point, the boy that works from the hotel, Henry, that's not actually Henry, but may as well just be Henry, informs Tommy that Tuppence received a telegram and then left for a train station. And, I mean, not really anything that is necessarily all that concerning. She just could be on another arm of the investigation. And, okay, at this point, he knows that she's not out for a loaf of bread. She might not be back immediately, but there's no cause for alarm. At which point Julius tells Tommy about his proposal, and we kind of glean Tommy's feelings for Tuppence at that point, taking umbrage at the notion that she would consider Julius's proposal until he learns that she just turned him down flat, at which point he is overcome with some manner of relief. Why? Well, we can only guess. Anywho, Tommy then asks Henry about the telegram and is informed that Tuppence crumpled and threw it in a way that is still available to read should they want to do so. And do so they do. Tommy and Julius read the telegram and realize Tuppence has fallen into a trap. Of course, Tommy wasn't the one that wrote it, but nevertheless, Tommy asked her to come to the Moat House in Ebury. Ebury? I'll just say Ebury. Now realizing the urgency of the situation, now realizing the danger, Tommy and Julius hop a train right quick to make their way also to the Moat House. And by the time they get there, it is decidedly empty. Moreover, it is fairly abandoned. It's been that way for a while. There's dust on the floor, the gates rusted off of its hinges, things like that. So by all accounts, nobody seems to have been there. However, it is nighttime, so they decide to reapproach in the light of day. And doing so just pretty much just reconfirms everything that they had already observed. Nobody's been there, dust is settled. It's just an abandoned house. But Tommy comes across Tuppence's brooch, indicating that yes, she indeed was there, but there's no evidence of anybody staying there. So really at this point, anything is kind of possible as far as, was she kidnapped? Was a car driven away? Who knows? Nobody knows. That's the point. So to try and find out, Julius and Tommy then take it upon themselves to investigate. They head into town. They start asking around about somebody that matches Tuppence's description, ask about a car that may have driven away from the Moat House, asking about the Moat House generally, asking, and investigating. And all the while coming up completely dry. Nothing yields any information, and a week passes. The 29th is approaching, and they finally come to the conclusion that maybe they should do what they should have done from the start and get the authorities involved. Amateurs aren't cutting it. Time is short. Let's get the professionals involved. So they do so. Only Tommy makes the correct observation that it doesn't need both of them. So why doesn't Julius go? Tommy stick around and maybe track down a few more leads. At which point later that day, Tommy receives a telegram from Julius saying, "Join me in Manchester Midland Hotel. Important news." And once he gets there, Julius says he found this waiting in London, having just arrived. A telegram: Jane Finn found. Come Manchester Midland Hotel immediately. Peel Edgerton. So this is a chapter that really kind of, it was a very stark departure from the previous one that was just completely rapid fire, everything happening all at once. And now we have a chapter where we let a week go by in the span of a couple sentences. It was a little bit jarring, not going to lie, but I am very curious to see where things are going. This really didn't offer anything in terms of any new information, at least nothing that I picked up on. Maybe you did, and I might be missing stuff. It more just asked more questions than anything else. Chief among them are, where is Tuppence? What happened to her? What's going on with Julius? Because I'm still not on board with anything about the guy. And what is going on with Jane Finn? What did Peel Edgerton find? Assuming it's actually Peel Edgerton. Assuming that telegram isn't another ruse and Tommy has just fallen into the trap of Julius. I don't think so. That doesn't make any sense. If Julius wanted him there, he wouldn't need anything as far as he would just say, "Hey, Tommy, get over here." He'd be like, "Okay." So yeah, I don't think it's anything along those lines, but I am very curious to see what winds up happening next in chapter 19. So let's find out together. Let's get to reading, and I'll check back in soon. I think I've got it. I think I've got something. Okay, I'm super excited. I think I may got something. All right, let's get into the chapter synopsis, and then I'll get into what I think I may have uncovered. All right, so Sir James arrives and meets Tommy for the first time, and then he explains that Jane Finn was knocked down in the street and regained her memory, but was currently under the care of a doctor friend and could not be seen until morning. Julius and Sir James butt heads. Their personalities continue to conflict, and Julius very much wants to see Jane Finn, but Sir James is pretty resolute. Nope, that isn't happening. You'll have to wait until 10 o'clock tomorrow. That's just the way of it. So the situation is just simply steadfast, and Julius has to resign himself to waiting. At which point, Tommy recounts the events of his story to Sir James, who said that he wished that he had been a part of the investigative crew that went back to the house after it had been abandoned and checked things out. He may have been able to find something that they may have missed. At which point, they realized that Sir James doesn't know about the Tuppence situation and the fact that she's missing and has been for a week. So they fill him in on everything that's been going on there. He seems a bit dismayed and even a little bit, rightfully so, to be perfectly honest, a bit judgmental that they've wasted a week instead of getting authorities, or I'm assuming getting him. But for all Julius really knows, Sir James did know about. He gone. Tuppence was the only one that had a hint that he would continue working on things. So, and they don't really get along, Julius and Sir James. So the idea of contacting him for his help, it doesn't really surprise me that that didn't factor in with the decision-making process over the last week. And the conversation starts to turn back over to Mr. Brown, and Julius seems incredulous that Mr. Brown is indeed a real person, instead thinking he may just be a boogeyman or figurehead or something of the sort. And Sir James firmly believes that Mr. Brown is indeed a real person that is nefarious and behind all of this. So the next morning, the men go to see Jane Finn, and she is sitting in bed with a bandage around her head, speaking with an American accent, which is all right in line with expectations as far as everything the narrative has been telling us. And no real surprises there, aside from, well, she's sitting in front of them. So then Julius gets introduced to her as her cousin. They ask Jane about the papers that Danvers gave her, and then she informs them that she hid them in a cliff face rock at Holyhead, and then gave very detailed accounts of the landmarks and thorn bushes and so forth that would lead to that area. Here's my line of thinking on the whole Jane Finn situation. I stand by that she is Annette, or was Annette, that Annette was her. I am now taking that the amnesia thing was indeed real. I am now thinking that that is face value. No reason to really look any deeper than that. Assuming this whole Jane Finn situation that Sir James has put forth in front of them is indeed real, which I kind of do believe it is, then yeah, Annette and Jane Finn, same person, and they recognize that. So what I'm thinking happened is Jane Finn survived the Lusitania sinking, hid the papers as described, got knocked out on the train as described, and instead of just simply being knocked out and taken away, she did indeed develop amnesia. So she was held on to as a bargaining chip. And I believe that this is where Rita Vandermeyer and Boris may have butted heads. So the idea that she woke up and didn't even speak her native tongue seems to suggest that perhaps she was speaking in a different language or had to learn language, possibly French, Annette, which would also lend a little bit of credence towards Edward Whittington operating at the instruction of Mr. Brown in the hiring of Tuppence in the first place to speak with a slight American French accent and be held up in a French boarding school. Why? Because I believe that while some group of nefarious means were holding on to Annette, knowing that she was Jane Finn and she could get her memory back at any moment, so the information that was locked away in her brain was valuable, so they need to keep her under wraps, so they call her Annette. They had her work around the house. Mrs. Vandermeyer clearly knew who she was. She needed to get back to Marguerite, things like that, that the other group was trying to potentially replace her. So hiring on a girl that was willing to speak with a French accent like Tuppence and go forth from there. So that's my line of thinking in terms of the big question of how all of this got started in the first place with Edward Whittington taking Tuppence and trying to employ her. I believe that it was as a replacement for Annette so that the other group could then hold on to Annette knowing that she was Jane Finn and had the memory locked away. To kind of address the whole, well, wouldn't Tommy recognize her? Not necessarily. If her head is wrapped up in bandages so he can't see her hair and she's speaking with a different accent, then he might not immediately recognize that she is indeed Annette. And there was still something that he vaguely recognized about her. He just didn't place her as the same girl. So in a totally different situation, being called a different name, expecting a different person, can't see her hair, different accent, it would stand to reason that there would be something familiar, but he wouldn't actually place the exact similarities there. That's my theory. That's what I got going on right now. So now looking at the board and the questions, we have, if I'm right, 3 out of the 4 of them are now answered. We know where Jane Finn is because I'm taking that at face value. We know where the treaty is because I'm taking her word at face value. And I have my theory on why did Mr. Brown want somebody to pose as Jane Finn in the French boarding school. I don't know if the boarding school had anything to do with it, but nevertheless, someone posing as her that they could steal away and then swap out. The big question from here is, who is Mr. Brown? Getting back to the big cast of characters here. Let's see. We have Carter, still thinking he's fine there. James Japp hasn't really factored into anything here. We have the new character of Dr. Roylance that was a friend of Sir James. Dr. Hall. We have the Fortnight felons, including Conrad. None of them seem to really be involved with any of this aside from as henchmen. So, exhausting everybody, I think it might be Albert. I think that Albert is Mr. Brown. Oh, the little boy who works at the South Audley Mansions. He's the one coordinating all of it. He has close ties. No, I'm just joking. We still have the big 2 culprits here. We have Sir James Peel Edgerton, and we have Julius P. Hersheimmer. I still am not entirely sold on either of them actually being Mr. Brown. It could be we haven't actually met him yet, but I'm still thinking that Julius is not who he says he is. Really, the thing that is completely holding me back from Julius being Mr. Brown himself is the fact that Tuppence has met Mr. Brown and met Julius and didn't tie them together. Granted, she only met Mr. Brown for half a moment as he entered the door and introduced her at that initial meeting that got everything kicked off. So it was only for a fleeting moment, and he was a bit nondescript. And I guess that could track. If we recall back in chapter 5 here, where we get introduced to Julius B. Hersheimmer, his only real description that he was given was a great deal younger than either Tommy or Tuppence had pictured him. The girl put him down as 35. He was of middle height and squarely built to match his jaw. His face was pugnacious but pleasant. No one could have mistaken him for anything but an American, though he spoke with very little accent. So there's marks on both sides of the argument with that. On one hand, the idea that nobody could recognize him as anything but American kind of makes me think that he had very distinctive features. On the other hand, he was of middle height, square jaw, that could be anybody, and spoke with very little accent. That kind of lends itself to a bit of a nondescript character, or at the very least, average character that one might just gloss over if one were just entering into a meeting and somebody opened the door and introduced them. At this point, it's a coin toss for me. Julius could be Mr. Brown. He could be working for Mr. Brown. The one thing I don't think he is Julius P. Hersheimmer, Jane Finn's cousin that is on the up and up and has been honest about everything. So that's what I got so far. That's my theory on the Jane Finn, Annette situation and why the whole thing got started in the first place. I'm very curious to see if I'm right on that. And chapter 20 might reveal that. So I'm eager to get to reading, and I look forward to catching back up in just a moment. All right, so some of my theory is starting to get a little bit shaky, but nevertheless, I'm going to do this synopsis fairly quickly here. I'm going to just kind of blaze through it, which may be folly, but it kind of feels like we have this much of the book left to go, and I want to keep that tempo up. I'm very excited to get to the next chapter. So Sir James instructs Tommy and Julius to go searching for the Danvers papers without hesitation, and then also says he can't come along. He has a meeting he cannot afford to miss. Bringing up Mr. Brown, Julius is confident and explains that he carries a gun with him at all times, and then the two set off. And then Julius tells Tommy that his original idea was to actually ask Jane to marry him. His cousin. Neat. Different time, era, I suppose. Moving on. Also mentioned that she didn't look like her photo, but must have been because he recognized her right off. There was something of a familiar quality that he could have picked out of the crowd as somebody that, I clearly know her. And after that, I mean, it kind of turns into just a fair bit of a chunk of thing where they, in the end, get to the spot, find the oilskin pouch, still sewn up, make a mention. It's queer. You'd think the stitches would have rotted. And then once they opened it, a small piece of paper was inside with invisible ink that once heated, the paper read with the compliments of Mr. Brown. So, there's elements of my theory that, like I said, is kind of getting shaky now. I haven't completely ruled out anything, but Julius... there's parts of me that is more and more believing his story just because it's so odd that it almost has to be true. I'm still not convinced. There's unanswered questions in that regard. Like, what was he doing in the safe? Why did he send those cables? And then there still are the unanswered questions of how did the Fortnite felons get on to Tommy and his ruse, who tipped off Mrs. Vandemeyer when Tuppence was on her way over. There's a lot of questions that are still unknown there. And now we have a really big one. How did Mr. Brown get to the pouch first? That's a huge one because we know that Jane Finn had not revealed the location until just now. And whoever it was had to have been faster than Julius and Tommy getting there by train. So there's a couple different ideas that are in play there, some of which would throw my previous theory to the wind. One of which is that is not Jane Finn. I know. Or Annette. it could be that the whole concept of the plant that Tuppence was trying to be hired to be was what was sitting in front of them, that the plan actually came to fruition. They found a girl to pretend to be Jane Finn and sit in that hospital room and give them bad information. But why? To what end? I really can't think of anything. The other idea is that Sir James is Mr. Brown and set them off on a wild goose chase and was able to get there faster because he was able to get the information before them, that was why he insisted that they not speak to Jane until 10 o'clock the next morning, because he wanted to have enough lead time for whomever his minion might be to get there ahead of time and replace the oilskin pouch with the newer one with the invisible ink in it. But then that also begs the question of why put a new oilskin pouch there? Why put a letter with invisible ink? Why taunt Tommy and Julius? Why not just take the treaty and call it done? I mean, his goal is to upend the UK government and use this treaty to do so. So these two individuals that are just kind of being a fly in the ointment, why tease them? Well, I mean, other than hubris, which is entirely possible, which is also possible that if it is Sir James, that he's really enjoying operating as Mr. Brown in plain sight of them side by side the entire time. I don't know. And like I said, I don't want the tempo to really die down. So I'm eager to find out, which means I'm eager to get to reading. I'm sure you are too. So let's get to chapter 21 together and we'll catch back up. All right, so there are elements of my theory that are being a little bit more solidified and a few that are being continued to be unraveled and dismantled. So let's just get quickly into the chapter synopsis here. Tommy and Julius seem resigned to their failure. Tommy returns to London to inform Mr. Carter that Mr. Brown has the treaty. They have failed. Mr. Carter takes the news with a certain sense of despair, but is still quite kind about it. You were up against the absolute best of the best, and you nearly succeeded, so take that to heart. And then Mr. Carter informs Tommy that Tuppence apparently was killed, as a body has washed up on shore with her coat and handkerchief. Back at the Ritz, Tommy receives a letter from Sir James sympathizing about the Tuppence situation that he heard about and offering a job in Argentine. Julius then comes in and attempts to sympathize about Tuppence, and Tommy grows angry. They have a big fight. And during this fight, Julius remembers why Jane seems so familiar, that she was dressed as a nurse talking to Whittington when he was hanging outside the house on the tree branch. And by gum, she must have been in on it with the whole time. The argument grows until the two men finally part, Julius leaving for home. And then Tommy calms down a little bit, decides to answer Sir James's letter as the fact that he sent it and offered the job was a kindness. But he has no paper, so he goes to Julius's now vacant room to get some and sees a picture of Annette. So my mind is swimming with questions. I am absolutely drowning in them. So the idea that I had about that wasn't Jane Finn sitting there telling them the story, that was the original plan, that Tuppence was going to be taking her place and pretending to be Jane Finn, come to fruition. They found a different girl. In this case, they found the nurse that was already kind of in on everything and dressed her up, put the bandage around her. So that wasn't Annette. But the idea that Jane Finn was Annette still seems to be holding water if that was the picture that Julius had. But again, questions abound. If Julius is on the up and up, then why does he have the picture of Jane Finn / Annette? Because he said that he doesn't have any more pictures, that there are no more in existence. And then as far as the whole ruse with the nurse pretending to be, then why? To what end? Aside from the possibility that Mr. Brown just wants everybody off of his tail. He has these annoying gnats flying around him. And if they think that he already has the treaty, then they're going to stop looking for it. So maybe he planned this elaborate ruse, and that would explain how he got there ahead of time, is because the treaty in the oilskin pouch is still somewhere in the world and they don't know where. That, if Annette still has the amnesia, or Jane Finn still has the amnesia, then they're still trying to find it. And what better way to be the first in a race than to eliminate the other competition and dissuade them from even looking? So yeah, it could have been a ruse set up so that they think they've already failed and they stop looking, and Mr. Brown and his cohorts can continue on with their quest for the treaty. So if Julius is on the up and up, again, why did he have the picture? If he's not on the up and up, then why would he reveal that he first spotted Jane dressed as the nurse in that house? There's something really weird going on surrounding him generally, and I can't quite wrap my head around what it could be. Again, I am awash in questions, but you know what might answer those questions? Chapter 22. So allow me to, for a minute, have a smug moment. Looks like several of my theories are actually turning out to be potentially correct. Who knows? Everything can change at the last minute. But so far, we pick back up with the story, and this time we have moved over to 10 Downing Street itself, where the Prime Minister is talking to Mr. Carter in regards to the correspondence that Mr. Carter received from Tommy. And Tommy says that the girl in Manchester was a plant, and not only does he know where the real Jane Finn is, but also possibly the treaty. And the plant was put in place with the object of throwing us off the scent that we must have been getting very close indeed. Just curious what conclusions you came to prior to this. If you came to the same ones that I did, feel free to leave comments on anything as we go along here. But he put the details of his findings in an envelope with the instructions not to open it until the last minute, because to do so early could put the lives of Tuppence, who he believes is alive, and Jane Finn in jeopardy. And then he asked for an original copy of the fake telegram that set Tuppence off, that was supposedly came from Tommy, and we get to that in a little bit. In the meantime, Sir James enters the room and the conversation, revealing that he actually talked to Tommy over the phone, and also asked Mr. Carter to retrieve some information about an article regarding a man's body washed up near some docks in New York. Sir James reveals in his phone conversation with Tommy that Tommy said the photo that he found was of Annette, and that he put it back where he found it. And in regards to the original telegram, it indeed had been altered after Tuppence had read it, and the original one read Gatehouse in Kent. And it seems to me that Sir James is very clearly suspecting Julius a bit more verbally now. I think he always had, but now he's taking it from internal dialogue and actually incorporating it a little bit more into his verbal conversations. And as far as the American newspaper article that Mr. Carter is going to be looking into about the man's body washed up in New York, me personally, I think that seems a little bit obvious that he is looking for the actual Julius Hersheimmer, because I don't doubt that Jane Finn does have a cousin and does have bloodlines that are wealthy. It would stand to reason to come up with a ruse that was as close to the truth as possible. And if she's never actually met this particular family member, then taking his place after killing him would be a fairly simple task indeed. So then we skip forward to 2 days later. Julius returned from Manchester and finds a note that Tommy left him saying he was taking the job in Argentine. Smile erupts on his face, and he says, "That darned fool," as he crumples the note. So Julius did not go home as I thought he said. I may have been a little bit off on that one, but he did indicate that he was leaving for good. And I guess it was a good thing that Tommy put the photo back where he found it, because he guessed correctly that Julius would be back. And I think everything is really lining up to set off several of my theories as potentially being correct. But again, anything could change at the last minute. And in terms of the questions that are still kind of on the table there, we have where Jane Finn is. And I think that the most likely situation there is that she is at the Gatehouse in Kent, along with Tuppence. And what the status of her memory is, that's a good question. We're still not entirely sure on that, although I have a feeling that if her memory was intact and she revealed the location of the papers, that, well, she would be no longer of any use, and done deal on that one. And that would be the other question, is where the heck are these papers? If the ruse was put in place because they were getting too close, I think that begs the question, well, too close to what precisely? And so up next is chapter 23, and we will see if this fog continues to get lifted as more questions get answered. So I'll get to reading, you'll get to reading, and we'll catch back up in just a moment. And now this chapter kicks off with Tommy heading to the South Audley Mansions and requesting the help of Albert, the actual mastermind and Mr. Brown of the whole situation. Tommy doesn't see it yet, but I'm sure he'll come around to my line of thinking on that one, but then asks Albert to get out of work, feign a relative's death, and come with him. So the two scrappy lads then head off to Charing Cross, to Gatehouse Kent, and to Astley Priors. And at first, nothing really seems that odd. The townsfolk talk about the occupant of the house as a fairly well-respected physician. No real thing of note. Everybody, is largely positive vibe about the place. Looks innocent. So Tommy's a little bit, well, do I have this right? And kind of getting a little bit crestfallen, a little bit doubting himself. But the next day's stakeout at night revealed the silhouette in the window of Tuppence up on the second floor, which elated Tommy. And honestly, I do think that was kind of cute that just by looking at the silhouette, he recognized Tuppence. So at that point, he wanted to get her attention. So he walked in the area right outside the house, singing a song loudly, pretending to be a drunken fool with a song that he knew Tuppence would recognize would be him. At which point, the butler and a footman exited the house, grabbed him, and escorted him off the property. The butler he recognized was Mr. Whittington. So yeah, clearly they do indeed have the right place. So Tommy retired to the inn after that, and Albert followed shortly after, saying that a note had dropped out of that second-story window saying, "Tomorrow, same time." Albert revealing at that point that he sent a response back through the window saying that they were at the inn. Albert really proving to be just a really fun character and wild imagination, just really adding a lot of spice to the stew here. Later, Tommy gets his evening interrupted by a note being delivered to him in Tuppence's handwriting saying that they are taking her to Holyhead in the morning, which is the same area where the ruse was happening of the oilskin pouch and the rock. So Tommy told Albert to start packing. We need to go now, and then took a moment and recanted, saying, nope, don't start packing. Something's wrong. Obviously, he found something of note in that note. I really don't have a whole lot of notes about this chapter. It's just generally kind of continuing on with things. The only real question that I have that's kind of popping up squarely at me is what in the world was in that note that tipped Tommy off? It was in Tuppence's handwriting, it did say, "I'll be lying in wait for you. They'll taken us away this morning. I heard something about Wales, Holyhead. I'll drop this on the road if I get the chance. Annette told me how you'd escaped. Buck up. Yours, Tuppence. Twopence." So I don't know if there's something there. I'm missing it. Tommy sees it. I'm missing it. And I'm very curious to see what it is. So lacking anything other than just rambling, which doesn't do either of us any good, I'm just inclined to go straight to chapter 24. So how about you? Let's do that and meet back up. Well, this chapter certainly was a roller coaster ride, wasn't it? I know, especially for me, it was because I went through a lot of different thought processes as the chapter went on, and I'll kind of explain them as we go. But going to the synopsis here, Kremenin gets kidnapped by Julius. It was a big portion of this and a lot of dialogue and a lot of back and forth, but ultimately that's just kind of what it shook out to, was he gets kidnapped by Julius. The only thing I really put of note there is that during the altercation, Kremenin says he has met Mr. Brown face to face, which would throw some of the whole Julius being Mr. Brown thing into question, certainly. I'm still not entirely sold on it. I'm going to get to that in just a bit. But when they get downstairs, Julius keeps a gun on Kremenin while his chauffeur George drives to the gatehouse in Kent. And once they arrive, Julius has Kremenin put on a ruse, still at gunpoint, saying the girls must be transported immediately at the behest of Mr. Brown. Once the girls and Kremenin are in the car, the jig is up. Somebody gets sighted and a mad dash is made, driving away with gunfire blazing behind them. It's all very exciting. And then Kremenin is pleading to be let free to escape to Russia. He says they know he betrayed them and his life is now worthless. So before the car even finishes coming to a stop, he leaps out. And they continue driving on at high speed, George at the wheel. And at that point, Julius reveals that Annette is indeed Jane Finn, who pleads to be let out. They're after me. I don't want anybody else to get hurt. Very noble of her. But she's all saying it in an American accent. And when Julius notes that and guesses that she was faking her memory loss, she nods and cries, confirming that. So just to kind of pause, the synopsis for a little bit. This is the roller coaster ride that I went on. Is once the chapter started and Julius is kidnapping Kremenin, my thoughts were, well, that he couldn't possibly be Mr. Brown or even working for him. He's taking matters into his own hands and apparently trying to rescue the girls. I mean, we're not seeing this through the eyes of Tommy or anybody else that he may be trying to issue some manner of subterfuge. It's simply him and Kremenin, and this exchange is happening. So we should be seeing what ultimately should be the truth of it. But I don't think so. And it's this portion where he guesses and she confirms that she was faking her memory loss that clued me in to the why of the whole endeavor. Time is getting short. The 29th is they're right on the doorstep of it. Whatever plan Mr. Brown has in mind, it's got to be executed very soon, which means the treaty does need to be found. And it may be a bit of a Hail Mary pass that in order to either flesh out her memory or confirm or deny that she has been faking it the whole time, perhaps they need to fake her rescue and get her feeling like she's out of the hands of the madmen and into the potential womb of safety. So yeah, faking a rescue operation would be a really good way to get her to let her guard down and admit that to the bad people that she's been in the hands of the entire time. As far as Kremenin saying that he had met Mr. Brown face to face, kind of what I'm wondering, I know I've posited this sporadically throughout this entire series now, but I do question whether anybody except perhaps Rita Vandermeyer actually ever met Mr. Brown. And that includes the assistant Brown from Tuppence's first meeting with Whittington. If Julius is Mr. Brown, it could be a situation where, yes, nobody has actually met him, and any instances in which anybody actually thinks they have was indeed just an assistant or a hire or somebody that was put in place for those purposes. And if Julius is indeed Mr. Brown in actuality, everything would suggest from his mannerisms and how he's been working alongside Tommy and right in front of Peel Edgerton and so forth, that he enjoys playing this close to the chest, but at the same time, messing with people's minds and sidling right up next to them with a smile and them not knowing who he actually is. It seems like it might be a thrill to him in some way. And continuing on, they stop at a crossroads. Tommy leaps into the car, apparently having held onto the back of the car ever since they left the house, instructs the girls to leave, take the train to London, and seek the safety of Sir James. And at Julius's objections, Tommy grabs his gun and points it at him. So here's the thing that I'm kind of wondering at this point is I've had my doubts about Julius and my suspicions about Julius, but Tommy seems to be acting in a way that is beyond just suspicions. He's acting in a way that would suggest he has proof. And something about that note seems to have been that trigger point. And it does have me kind of wondering what that is. The only thing I can really think, and this is really, really stretching it, I don't think this is what it is, but it's the only thing I got, is the Tuppence, the sign off of the note that Tommy got, Twopence. It might be the kind of thing that an American hearing a British accent would, if he's never seen Tuppence in writing, might interpret that that's how everybody's been saying it this whole time, and just assuming that that's how it was written, Twopence. Yeah. That's so flimsy, though. I will be extraordinarily surprised if that's correct. But yeah, I'm curious. Again, if Julius is Mr. Brown, I'm pretty sure he is. And if he is, what proof that Tommy is now acting on that? And I have a feeling a lot of that is going to be answered in chapter 25. So let's continue on. We seem to be fast approaching the end of this book, and a lot of revelations are going to be happening, and I'm eager to get to them. So we'll catch back up in just a little bit. A lot of revelations, as I thought there might be. With instead of continuing on with the Tommy Julius storyline, we instead move over to the two girls, Tuppence and Jane Finn, who are making their way for the train, fearing that they are being followed, keep seeing a flash of somebody's face, and indeed they are. They are being followed. As soon as they leave the train, they do a mad dash of taxi switching in a rousing chase by car and by foot until they finally show up at the doorstep of Sir James. And just in the nick of time, there were henchmen straight on their tail up until the last minute there. Once it's safe inside, Sir James is telling, in your own time, rest up first. And he's like, no, I got to get this story told. It's got to happen now. And so we finally hear the entire story of Jane Finn straight from the horse's mouth. In terms of the sinking of the Lusitania, of Mrs. Vandermeyer sidling up to her and paying close interest, replacing the papers that were in the oilskin pouch with blanks and placing the real ones in between pages of the magazine that she was holding, and then getting abducted and cracked over the head, at which point she was slowly waking up, decided to feign amnesia. She was already, fairly well spoken in French by virtue of wanting to work in Paris for the war effort, and she managed to pull it off and become convincing about it. Kudos to her for that. But in the meantime, while she was trapped in that room in the house in Soho, she moved the papers from the magazine to the backing behind one of the paintings that was on the wall, one of the 3 paintings depicting Faust. So now that we know where the papers are, Sir James wants to go get them immediately. There's no time to waste. But before he sets off, Tuppence stops him and is like, wait, there's something we need to talk about first. The identity of Mr. Brown, saying that she had come to the conclusion. Also, it seems that Sir James came to the conclusion, and we also know that it appears that Tommy came to the conclusion that it is indeed Julius B. Hersheimmer. And Jane Finn's surprised. She said, oh my goodness, my own cousin. And Sir James says that the man using the name Julius is of no relation to her, calling back to the whole thing about the American newspaper article about the man found with his face smashed in at the New York docks. So yeah, that's pretty much what I suspected about the actual Julius B. Hersheimmer being replaced so that he could use his identity in the attempt to sidle up to Jane Finn. I'm trying to think of any more loose threads to tie up, any more questions that need answering. But just looking at the questions here, we know where the treaty is, like for absolute certainty now. We know why Mr. Brown wanted somebody to pose as Jane Finn in terms of the Tuppence situation, or at the very least, we know generally, the fact that they have employed a fake Jane Finn's for the purposes of it would stand to reason that they would want, a fake Jane Finn in their pocket. Where is Jane Finn? Well, she's sitting in the room right now. And who is Mr. Brown? We finally have the answer solidly for that. So I have as far as a mystery goes, the questions have been answered. And now at this point, our characters are in danger and they also need to get their hands on the treaty. So it's no more questions to be answered. It's the narrative needing to be wrapped up. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's move on to the next chapter and see how the secret adversary finishes off. Here we go. Damn it. I was just telling my wife, I'm serious. I was just telling my wife when chapter 25 finished up that I was so happy to have figured out an Agatha Christie novel for the most part, like a majority percentage of it. And that I swear I was joking. I'm like, but I still got 3 more chapters left to go. So now I'm just waiting for it to be like, what? No, it wasn't. Chapter 26. We get picked back up with Sir James reveals the article about the dead man in New York and talks about Julius being killed so Mr. Brown can take his place. Then talks about why Julius helped them escape as a way to draw out the truth from Jane. The 3 set off for the house in Soho. The police are standing guard, confirms that nobody else has entered the house. So they go inside, go to the room, and retrieve the treaty. The girls are kind of in a state of heightened suspicion. There's danger lurking all around them, and they can feel it in the air. And Sir James says, you can feel that too? Yeah, you're right. Mr. Brown is here. Not Julius, but me, Mr. Brown. Yeah, he reveals that he himself is Mr. Brown. Gun pointed at the girls, he reveals how he will kill them, injure himself, and then walk out with no suspicion cast upon him. And then he gets gripped from behind. The gun pulled from his hand. Julius and Tommy are standing there. At which point, Sir James puts the signet ring up to his mouth, says in Latin, "Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you," and then collapses with the smell of almonds in the air. Damn it! This has been fun. I'm frustrated, but it's such a fun level of frustration. This is for this video series. This now makes 2 for 2 that Agatha Christie has completely gotten the drop on me. I know I have mentioned my suspicions about P.L. Edgerton in the past, but I mean, honestly, I put suspicions on everybody. That's how these things go. As things go on, I'm going to be putting suspicions on people. And, as you've seen, if you're watching this video series, I discounted it. At some point I just dropped the suspicion. I was like, well, no, he's helping them. He seems to be above reproach. He's talking to the prime minister. Yeah. The whole, oh God. I knew it was either going to be Julius or him. And I was in the 90 percentile of it being Julius. I hadn't completely discounted Sir James, but for the most part I had. So now I'm very curious about wrapping up all the loose threads that may be in play now with this reveal, as we are probably going to be, winding things down over the next 2 chapters and having discussions between Julius, Tommy, and Tuppence. And what I'm curious about more than anything else at this point is, how did Tommy know? How did he come onto things? What was in that note? My God, that note just turned everything around. It was just like this switch flip for him. Tuppence had her own little switch flip, but that seemed to point to Julius. And yeah, how did Tommy know? I got to know. I got to find out. Let's get to it. Let's just finish this off. Let's get to it. Chapter 27 awaits us both. Damn it. All right. So I feel a smidge better now. Yeah. This chapter starts off with Julius throwing a massive supper party. Spared no expense. Everything that could possibly be laid out on a dinner table, everybody could enjoy. He gifts a check to Tuppence to go dress shopping with Jane and is clearly showing interest. They wrap up the whole thing about Tuppence's proposal from Julius and the fun awkwardness that ensued from there. And at the supper party, several friends were in attendance, including Tommy's uncle and Tuppence's father. And in this, Tommy's uncle proclaims familial bygones and invites him to live on the family estate and be granted an allowance. Very generous there. I guess it's the least he could do for Tommy being a savior of the country. We get into a lot more details about the nation's post-actions, Mr. Carter's post-actions in the newspapers, and how everything kind of gets played out in the public light in terms of everything kind of wrapping up with Mr. Brown. With the head cut off, the body dies, and everything just kind of peters out, and peace is found. So at the party, everybody is insisting that Tommy reveal the details. How did he know? Which is what I wanted to know. And it turns out it was that little smidge percentage that I thought might be it. Turns out that was what actually drew his suspicions and confirmed for him that it was Sir James. But he came to the same suspicions that everybody else did after the course of Mrs. Vandemeyer's death, that the idea that she did that to herself, even accidentally, was fairly ludicrous. So it could have only been one of the 2 men that were in there. And so, trying to flesh out which of the 2 men it actually was, I went through the same journey. The thing that I missed was that Julius did see Tuppence's name in writing through notes that she had left, but Sir James had not. So the idea of Tuppence being spelled incorrectly in a kind of a phonetic fashion with an accent attached to it that someone might assume is how her name is spelled, and Sir James being the only person that had not yet seen it in writing, was the thing that really solidified it for Tommy. So the rest of the evening kind of wraps up. Everything, all the little details get spurted out, and we get the loose ends just neatly cut off and cauterized. And Mr. Carter reads entries from Mr. Brown's diary that he kept on his person, revealing details of his history and his mindset in trying to become the criminal mastermind of our age. I'm perfectly happy with all of this. I think that it is fun to get bamboozled by Agatha Christie. I have a few final thoughts, but we have one more chapter to go. We're just going to, put a bow on everything. So let's just get through it, see how the characters wind up in their happy little ending here with the last chapter, chapter 28. And so there we have it. The chapter concludes with Julius proposing to Jane, and then Tommy and Tuppence kind of sort of proposing to each other, basically just agreeing upon marriage and being very happy. So everybody has their happily ever after. The only thing is, the only note I'll make, just seems like a bit of a lost opportunity here. So if you'll indulge me for a moment here. What fun it will be, responded Tuppence. Marriage is called all sorts of things, a haven and a refuge and a crowning glory and a state of bondage and lots more. But do you know what I think it is? What? A sport. And a damn good sport too, said Tommy. A sport? Man, I mean, if ever there was an opportunity to say an adventure, these are the Young Adventurers Limited Club or whatever from chapter 1. Yeah, they're the Young Adventurers. It'd be an adventure. I don't know. I just thought that would have been like a sport. Really threw me. Anyway, that's The Secret Adversary. Final thoughts on this one. I maintain, I offered my opinion that both things could be true at the same time, that I enjoyed it and it was my least favorite Agatha Christie. And I think that that holds true, but I really do want to be absolutely 100% clear here. I enjoyed it. And I think I enjoyed it even more after that statement. I thought the pacing was really interesting. The idea of it being a very linear story of this espionage, spy, intrigue type criminal mastermind underground thing was a very different take than I had ever read from her before. And there was an aspect of that that threw me, but I mean, I'm not going to gatekeep her on her own writing that it should be this or it should be that. I'm just going to enjoy the ride for what it is. The characters I quite enjoyed. I love the Tommy and Tuppence characters and their interaction with one another. This was fun for me. The only thought that I have is there's a lesson that I'm starting to learn in Agatha Christie novels. And I know I kind of wrapped up the last video with saying this, but I'm really feeling it more and more as I go along, especially after this last reveal, that it really should be the person that is not having attention drawn to them that I should be suspecting most. I'm trying to decide how that will actually make for an engaging video, though, because I can anticipate this. I can anticipate this happening in future videos where clues are getting dropped, casting suspicion on other characters, and I have to acknowledge them. They're part of the, they're part of the literature. I'm discussing the literature. I'm going over each chapter in a synopsis. I'm drawing threads together and finding clues and hopefully, coming to some conclusions here. But it also means that as I'm evaluating them, I also have to completely discount them, or at the very least, not attribute them to any positive outcome in any one particular character. If there's something that the writing is saying it's person A, then I have to start assuming it's not person A. And that's going to be interesting in terms of theorizing verbally, vocally with each chapter break here, because I'm going to have to say, well, all the clues are pointing to this person, and that's why I don't think it's them. I think it's this person that we haven't even had any clues about. But we'll just have to see how that goes. I have a feeling that I kind of feel like I am getting better at this already, and I'm curious to see how that will just continue down the line as these novels continue, as I get more adapted to the writing style that is continuing to keep me on my toes. And I got to say, I am loving this journey, and I am very inspired to keep going. So I am going to go ahead and get started working on the third video of the third book in this series, Murder on the Links. Focus. There you go. Murder on the Links. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. It would help me out a whole lot. If you are a part of any literary circles, or if you enjoyed this video and you have book clubs or friends that you would like to share this with, it would mean the absolute world to me. I would love to get this channel really on its feet, and I can't do that without your support. So again, if you like this video, if you enjoyed this series, if you have any comments, if you like this book, whatever you want to say, please say it in the comments. I would love to hear from you. What were your thoughts about this book? What were your thoughts about the mystery, the reveal, the Tommy Tuppence character, my video, my presentation style, anything in the world? I would absolutely love to hear from you. So I look forward to seeing you as we tackle Murder on the Links and pretty much every video from here on out. I'll talk to you soon. Have a great day, everybody.